Welcome everyone. This is the second webinar in a series of 5 webinars for a workshop under the auspices of the National Academy of Sciences Environmental Health Matters Initiative. Today, we're going to be continuing our workshop series, Reducing the Health Impacts of the Nitrogen Problem. My name is Kathy Kling. I'm a Tisch University professor at Cornell University, and I'm delighted to have been the chair of the organizing committee for this important webinar and workshop. I am waiting for my slides, which repeats that title, and here they come. In the meantime, please note that we are using a Slack channel to augment and encourage conversation and questions. So if you look below your Zoom screen, you should see directions on how to get into that Slack channel, and we really encourage your participation, comments, questions, interaction. As I said, this is Reducing the Health Impacts of the Nitrogen Problem. And this is, again, to repeat, the second in a workshop series of 5 webinars. Next, please. I'm the chair of the committee that has organized and planned this workshop. The other members of the committee are shown on your screen here. Alina Austin, Jerry Hatfield, who will be moderating the session today, Jim Galloway, Jennifer McPartland, Robin Wilson, and Raj Khosla. In addition, it's very important for us to acknowledge the incredible heavy lift of the staff at the National Academies of Sciences. Carol Laney, Janelle Walsh-Thomas, and Sarah Harper have all been critical members in organizing, undertaking all of the logistics, and making sure things run smoothly. Thank you to them. Next, please. Before I turn this second workshop webinar over to Jerry Hatfield, who will moderate the rest of the day, I wanted to quickly review the purpose of the webinar and workshop, and give you a very brief summary of last week's foundational workshop. The title, Opportunities in U.S. Agriculture to Reduce Public Health Risks of Nitrogen in Water, identifies the goals of the workshop. We in the National Academies, under the Environmental Health Matters Initiative, want to provide a place for information exchange. And to provide a place for information exchange focused on the interdisciplinary science that is behind what we know about health risks, what we know about the role of nitrogen, the important role of nitrogen in agriculture, and the many ways in which nitrogen leaves agricultural fields and moves through water and potentially poses a health risk. The goal is an information exchange based on science, what we know, what we don't know. Second, we want that to then provide a platform for informed discussion. We want to be action-driven. We want to think about opportunities for change, opportunities that cross the private sector, producers and consumers, NGOs, the government sector, state and federal government policies, and everyone interested in this important issue. And importantly, we hope that this series of webinars and the overall workshop will move towards accelerating progress. We will be putting together a workshop synthesis at the end of the 5th webinar, but there will be no conclusions, there will be no recommendations drawn. This is an information gathering and communication activity. Next, please. As I said, what I want to do before turning this over to Jerry to run the rest of the workshop is a very brief overview. Those of you who were able to join us last week saw a terrific set of presentations under the title, What is the Nitrogen Problem? I'll give us a brief summary of that, but first I want to tell you that today's topic is what farm-level actions can be taken to address the nitrogen problem. We're now moving on farm and into decision-making to learn about the economics, the incentives, the motivations for the way in which farming is done, and the types of technologies that can be brought to bear on this problem. Next week, we'll be talking about landscape level actions and innovative technologies, followed in week 4 by possible changes or continuation of policies and development of markets to see the degree to which they might be able to contribute solving these problems. And our final workshop will be focused on reflection and synthesis. Next, please. Very briefly, last week, we heard from 6 speakers. I kicked off the event with a very quick high-level overview of the most important regulations and policies in the U.S. addressing nutrients in water. I noted that the 1972 Clean Water Act at the federal level regulates water pollution from industry, but that most of agricultural sources from what we refer to as non-point sources, cropland, for example, are not covered under that policy, and that the approach there is voluntary as opposed to regulatory. The Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974 regulates drinking water from public water providers, but likewise has a gap in that it does not cover about 15% of the US population, 43 million people, who draw their water primarily from private wells. Mary Ward provided an excellent overview about the state of knowledge. In summary, the strongest evidence for a relationship between drinking water nitrate ingestion and adverse health outcomes, including colloquially blue baby syndrome, because I can't pronounce that word, is for colorectal cancer, thyroid disease, and neural tube defects. Future studies of these and other health outcomes should include improved exposure assessment, especially for the highly exposed population using private wells. Craig Cox gave us an overview of what we know about the extent of contamination of drinking water sources, noting that those contamination has been observed at levels now understood to threaten human health, but a lack of concerted effort to collect data and monitor has left us unaware of the full extent of the issue. Next, please. From there, Ken Kassman talked about the critically important role of nitrogen fertilizer as an input to the productivity of food, fiber, and fuel production from agriculture, both here and around the world. And he suggested that a national agenda is needed to better understand how to balance production and environmental quality. Matt Helmers discussed nitrogen loss, the fact that it is prevalent throughout the United States agriculture, and is exacerbated by the use of annual crops and tile-drained landscapes that have fundamentally altered the hydrology of millions of acres in this country. Finally, Eric Davidson brought us back to the role of nitrogen, the fact that it is a leaky nutrient. It leaks out to the environment in many places along the continuum of our food system. And knowledge of where those leaks and inefficiencies occur and exist can help us to design and better target effective approaches to mitigate the problem. Next, please. With that, I'm going to show again a picture I shared last week, which emphasizes, I hope for you, the scale of the agricultural footprint in the United States. About 900 million acres of farmland have been reported through the 2017 agricultural census. It is an extensive area. About half, 45%, 44% of US land is used in agriculture. We're talking about nutrients coming in small amounts from large area, and I hope that that helps provide some important foundation for the discussion we're going to hear now. So next, I'm delighted to turn this to Jerry Hatfield, who will take away and take us on down into the farm and learn about lots of technologies and issues addressed facing farmers. Thank you, Jerry.
Thanks, Kathy, and welcome everybody to the second of our workshop series and all of this. And you know, as Kathy pointed out, and our speakers last week gave us a big overview of of nitrogen in the environment. All of this, and today we're going to explore really about technologies and really perceptions about nitrogen. And so we're going to start off with probably one of the most important pieces of this, and that's the what causes farmers to make the decisions that they do. And it's probably no one person better to describe this than Linda Prokope. And I should point out to the audience that all the bios are on the website for all the speakers, so I won't go through those, but it's my pleasure to welcome Linda Prokope to give us her reflections on just what decisions farmers make and the actions that they do. So Linda, thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. All right, well, thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak with you today about what motivates farmer decision-making around conservation. And on the left-hand side of my image here is a very famous figure. It's the diffusion of innovations curve developed by Everett Rogers many decades ago, but it is frequently pulled out in agricultural meetings to discuss farmers. Well, you've got the innovators who adopt really, really early, then you've got the early adopters, early majority, and then this group here at the end, the laggards, who are apparently the slow to never adopters. This is a helpful way to think about farmers, or really anyone, in terms of adoption of any kind of innovation. But there's a lot more to understanding decision making than just understanding this curve. So let's see, I am controlling the screen. There we go. There have been a number of studies over the last 3+ decades looking at what explains farmer decision making around conservation practices in the United States. We've done a couple of reviews of that literature published within the last couple of years. So most of what I'm going to talk about today comes from all of the literature across the entire United States. But when I actually show data, that all of my personal data comes from the Midwestern US, specifically Indiana, where I am, Illinois, and Iowa, affectionately known as the 3 I states, where we have a lot of tile drain agriculture. So I particularly like this model here to explain farmer behavior. And I'm going to, most of my talk, really just walk us through this model and think about what it tells us about farmer decision making. So all the way over here on the left, we have background factors. And there are 3 key types of background factors. There are sociodemographics. So for example, we know that the older a farmer is, the less likely they are to adopt a practice. Conversely, we know that the higher the education level of a farmer, the more likely they are to adopt a practice. So, demographics are interesting, of course, but it's hard to change demographics. They're not necessarily that helpful to understanding decision making. The component of personal characteristics that is much more interesting, I think, are really people's underlying values and personalities. And there are a number of different values that have been identified to be associated with conservation decision making. So farmers who have more of a stewardship identity or an innovator identity are much more likely to adopt practices than farmers whose primary identity is more financially motivated. So in other words, farmers who think about the environment in their decision making, or who just love to try new things. Relatedly, really, to innovator thinking is this role of systems thinking. Some recent studies have really shown that farmers who think about their system holistically, their farm as a combination of all of the different practices, all of the fields, all of the ecosystems, are much more likely to adopt conservation practices. And then farmers who are seekers and users of information are more likely to adopt practices. A number of farm characteristics are also associated with conservation adoption. So, for example, farms with livestock are more likely to adopt certain different types of practices. Larger farms are more likely to adopt conservation practices, and farms that are more vulnerable. So in this picture here on the right, where you see erosion, farms with more erosion, more vulnerable slopes are more likely to adopt practices. And then the final background factor is huge, right? It's really everything else that's going on in both the rural economy, but also globally. So commodity prices affect whether or not someone's going to adopt a conservation practice. The climate, and certainly climate change, and people's opinions, et cetera, towards climate change affect conservation adoption. Policies affect conservation adoption, and those can be state level, but primarily really federal level policies. And then all of us, right? So all of us are consumers of food and agricultural products, and what we demand and what we ask for also influences a farmer's decision making. So all of these different background factors are going on when a farmer is presented with a particular practice and is thinking about whether or not they would want to adopt it. When they're thinking about that, they're thinking about practices along these different characteristics. They're thinking, is it relatively advantageous? Is it better than whatever I'm doing already? How complex is it? Is it compatible with my existing practices? Can I observe it? Can I trial this on a small piece of land, and then can I see if it's effective? And then of course, risk. How risky is this practice? Is this something that I would actually want to do? I thought I would just pop up some pictures here. You're going to hear more about these types of practices later on this afternoon, but just so that we're all thinking about similar types of things. On the upper left here, we have cover crops. Down the bottom left, a wetland. And on the right, we have some nitrogen application. So these are very, very different practices. And these are just a very small subset of the different types of practices that a farmer is challenged to think about whether or not to adopt to help to address the nitrogen problem. All of these practices have different characteristics, and how a farmer perceives those different characteristics will be very much a function of their own personal background, where they are, what's going on in their community. The other thing to understand, of course, is one of those background factors that can really help influence someone's perception of a practice are policies that can help support the adoption. And at the federal level, we have a lot of what are called cost share programs, where effectively the government shares the cost of practice implementation with an individual farmer. In most of our states, throughout most of the US, the adoption of these types of practices is a voluntary decision, but that cost share money is available to sort of help incentivize the farmer to adopt, because all of these practices, as I'm sure you can well imagine, cost money. So just to bring some sort of, I guess, human feel to my talk, I pulled in some quotes here from some farmers just to illustrate some of the different practice characteristics and how those are mobilized and the kinds of things farmers say. So here's one from Iowa. I've never done cover crops. I can see some benefits of it, but when you get looking at the financial end of it, and then the interim who's paying for that for the producer and reduction in yields or whatever. So definitely some concerns here about risk. Are my yields going to go down? Is this going to cost me money? That's really sort of a relative advantage. Is this going to cost me more money than whatever else I'm already doing? We've all identified that when you need to put cover crop on, it's after harvest. It's not everybody has that time. So this is an illustration really of compatibility. If adopting a practice is not compatible with the way that you run your farm, perhaps the folks who are managing that farm also have off-farm jobs, it can be very challenging to do some practices that need to happen at different times of year. I've never done cover crops. I can see some benefits of it. Oh, that's the same quote. Oops, we won't read that one again. There was another quote that was good, but it's gone. If you're talking about cover crops, it's a timing thing. You get such small windows of time where you can do something that's a positive thing rather than a negative thing. I don't know how you mix that cover crops into the mix when you're trying to just take care of business. And you can see here, we see some compatibility around timing. We see some relative advantage. Is this good? Is this bad? But we can also see in this quote how someone's personal characteristics interface with those practice characteristics, right? So this is a farmer who's very financially motivated. And I'll just put a caveat out there that all farmers have to be financially motivated or they'll go out of business. But some farmers certainly are much more motivated by this business mentality than a stewardship identity or an innovator identity. So we see this background factor of business motivation interfacing with some of the characteristics of cover crops to lead to a pretty negative attitude towards cover crops, which is the next box here in our diagram. So these background factors, practice characteristics, affect three different real thinking around behaviors and specific practices. So they certainly inform an individual farmer's attitude towards a particular practice. They also inform norms and how a farmer thinks other people in their community think about this practice? Are other farmers doing this practice? Do people that they trust think this practice is a good idea? We've just concluded some work recently looking at counties across the 3 I-states. So counties that are very biophysically similar, but have very different levels of cover crop adoption. And what we found is that the counties with high levels of cover crop adoption, and high is relative, as you'll hear later from Alejandro, the counties with the higher level of cover crop adoption have what we identified through our focus groups and interviews as a cover crop culture. So there's real norm in those counties that cover crops are a good thing, and that if you have bare soil in the winter, that's a really bad thing, and that's negatively perceived in that community. Norms are very, very powerful for behavioral decision making. So the other piece, of course, of norms is who do farmers talk to and who do they trust and who influences them. And this data here is from a survey that was done in 2012, so it's a little dated, but I haven't really seen any data that suggests this is no longer accurate. But it's this is a survey conducted across 12 states in the Midwest, across the entire North Central region. And we asked farmers to indicate how influential the following groups and individuals are when you make decisions about ag practices and strategies. And they're grouped from left to right. So the groups on the left are the most influential, and then least influential on the right. And I want to point out who's here on the left. We have family, so not surprisingly, family is going to be influential on someone's decision making. But then we have chemical dealer, seed dealer, consultant. This is the private sector, right? These are not the folks that we're paying to go out and talk to people. That's their NRCS down here, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, Farm Service Agency, University Extension. This private sector is very influential. These are the folks who farmers are talking to the most often. They're talking to them about some of the day-to-day practices of their farm. And so we hypothesized, based on this data from our survey done in 2012, that trying to form partnerships with this private sector might be a really effective way to get conservation on the ground. And a number of different entities are now doing that throughout the Midwest, and are indeed finding that partnering with the private sector is very effective. One watershed we looked at was up in Michigan, the Saginaw Bay watershed. We partnered with the Nature Conservancy there to do an evaluation of a large program that was the Natural Resources Conservation Service, partnering with the Michigan Agribusiness Association. And we found that new farmers were coming in the door of government agencies to sign up for practices and to sign up for cost share funding, and they were being brought there by their private crop advisor. So it is very effective to really think about who farmers are talking to and try to loop them into the conversation to, again, try to influence norms. Then the third of these categories is perceived behavioral control. Perceived behavioral control is super important. This is how much you, the person, the farmer, or you, whatever decision it is, thinks, what kind of control they think they have over this particular behavior. So it could be technical. Do I think I have the right kind of equipment for this behavior? Do I think I have enough money to adopt this behavior? Do I actually control this decision? One of the really important barriers to someone having control over their behavior that emerges in the Midwest is the role of rented farmland. So this map actually looks very similar to the one Kathy showed earlier, which I wrote it down, but now I can't see what I wrote. The agricultural, where ag happens, basically. So the dark colors on this map, the dark maroon colors, is an overlay of counties that have high levels of nitrogen export and the percent of rented land, rented farmland. So in 60% of the land in the Midwest, and this is a problem across the country, the person farming the land does not own the land. If you don't own the land you're farming, you don't have a lot of control necessarily over the practices on that land. Conversely, if you're the landowner, right, I'm talking my whole model here, I'm talking about it from the perspective of the farmer, but you can also think about this from the perspective of the landowner. If you're the landowner, but you're not farming the land, you might not feel like you have control. And we've interviewed and talked to a lot of landowners who indeed say they don't feel like they have control. My tenant knows more about farming than I do. I don't want to interfere. I might lose them as a tenant. I don't have control over that decision. It's a huge issue. We've done some work partnering with the Nature Conservancy and Johns Hopkins University to try to reach these landowners and try to encourage them to talk to their tenants. So very briefly, we enrolled over 2,000 landowners in the 3I states into an experiment. And these were all people who had earlier responded to a postcard mailer and they had said, yes, I want to learn more about soil health. Our sample was 2,200 landowners, as I said, and these are folks who'd said they were not using cover crops in the last 3 years. We mailed over 800 of them a beautiful packet of information about cover crops and how they could get local support to learn more about cover crops. And we sent them information. Another group, we sent them information plus some template lease language that they could use to get conservation written into their leases with their tenants. And then a smaller subset, 479, we mailed them the information, the lease template, and a financial offer. And the financial offer was quite a generous financial offer, given the cost of adopting cover crops. We offered them funding to get 30 acres of cover crops adopted on one of their some of their farmland that they were not farming. And only 1.5% of those landowners took the financial offer. We did a subsequent trial where we mailed only 100 landowners much higher financial offer to see if they would take it, and only 5% of them took it. So this tells us many things. One thing this tells us is that money is not always the biggest barrier to adoption. I often say that money is necessary to get practices adopted because of course they cost money and we have to help fund those, but it's often not sufficient. There are other things that are barriers. And one of the big barriers, again, in the case of landowners, tenants, is really that relationship and getting the two sides to talk to each other. All right, so moving along our model, we have all of these different things. All of these come together to form somebody's intention to adopt a practice. Now, farmers are just like the rest of us and make all kinds of good intentions and don't follow through, right? It can be due to inertia, that I've made this decision, but I'm not actually taking the steps. It can also be because after you've made the decision to adopt a practice, you realize you don't actually have the control you thought you had. In the case, for example, of nitrogen application, it could be that you've made this intention I'm gonna apply my nitrogen throughout the growing season. That's better for runoff. It gets more of the nitrogen into the plants. And then you go to implement that, and you realize as you start looking into equipment and doing the rest of the pieces that, you know what, actually nitrogen is not available throughout the whole growing season in my area. So I don't really control that practice if I can't buy what I need at the right time. But in an ideal world, intention leads to behavior. And often our behavioral decision models stop at behavior. And I'm gonna suggest that we think about one more step, and that is this step of persistence. So it's not enough to just understand what motivates a farmer to adopt a practice. We really need to be looking at what motivates a farmer to continue using that practice into the foreseeable future. So cost share funding that I mentioned earlier does not last forever. And at some point, cost share funding goes away, and we would like a farmer to continue using the practice at that point. And so there's very little work done on understanding what motivates someone to persist with a practice, and we do need to do some more research in that space. Just very briefly here, as I wrap up, two things that I'm often asked about, and that you'll notice are not in my model. One was the role of financial incentives. So I mentioned, of course, that cost share is there, and I already said that is often necessary but not sufficient. So just providing money without addressing the other barriers to adoption is not going to be enough to move the needle. And then knowledge. So, in an ideal world, right, we could tell somebody how great something was and give them all of the knowledge in the world about it, and they would run off and do it. But we know that knowledge is not enough, right? Knowledge in the model that I've been showing is actually all the way over on the left in background factors. You have to have knowledge about a practice to understand the different practice characteristics and form your attitudes around those, to be aware of norms around that practice, et cetera. But knowledge is not sufficient to push adoption. And thank you for your time. And if we have time for questions, I am happy to entertain some.
And yes, we have time for questions. So Linda, you bring up that behavioral model and everything else that goes all the way from thinking about something to actually doing something. In all of this, do we begin to, what are some of you talked about a little bit of the characteristics, but are we seeing it as older producers or newer producers? Who's most receptive to making a change along this continuum?
So it varies a little bit based on the practice, right? Which is not necessarily surprising. In general, younger farmers are more likely to adopt practices. There is some evidence, and it's limited evidence, but there is some evidence for structural practices. So some of these off-farm edge-of-field practices, like wetlands, for example, and saturated buffers and other practices like that you'll hear about later, that older farmers are more likely to invest in those practices. And it makes sense if you think it through, right? If you're younger, you're investing in the farm, so cover crops, nitrogen application, et cetera. As you're older, you start thinking more about the next generation and making some investments for the next generation. So there's not necessarily always a consistent relationship with age and adoption.
Okay. I have another question, and that's a study paying to adopt cover crops. Farmers who adopted cover crops risked losing their crop insurance subsidies for Midwestern crop producers, and that provided a major financial hit and increased risk for them. So any comments about how we bring the crop insurance piece into this as a financial incentive or disincentive?
Yeah, I don't think it's as big a barrier as we think it is based on some survey work that we've done. And some of those issues with crop insurance have been addressed, but certainly it's both from, I guess, the insurer's perspective and the farmer's perspective, it's a little dicey to change your practices, right? And what's going to happen, and if the crop insurance is guaranteeing a certain yield and you're suddenly changing your practice, maybe that's going to alter it. I certainly think we could do something to guarantee the same revenue for a farmer, right? The same kind of yield. So if they trial a new practice for 2 or 3 years, we could say, we're going to guarantee if something fails, right, that we have your back, and we're still going to make sure that you make the money, and that would definitely remove a huge piece of the risk for farmers.
Okay.
Jerry, I don't have a hand raised thing that I can find. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, let me get one from Slack, and then I'll come back to you, Ken.
Right.
How can information on what practices shape behavior be used to promote adoption of practices?
There's a lot of information that we can pull out of this. It certainly helps us think about how we communicate with farmers. One thing, for example, I talked about systems thinking as a motivator for adopting practices. The adoption rate of cover crops in particular is quite low. And the way that we message cover crops to early adopters was with a systems thinking kind of a message, right? And as we understand that not all farmers think the same way, we hopefully start to recognize that maybe our messages also need to change as we're talking to different cross sections of farmers. So it certainly helps with that. It helps us understand what kind of behavioral assistance we can provide. How do we try to change norms? There's lots of different ways that can help inform our outreach.
Great. Ken, now you can ask your question.
Thank you, Jerry, and thanks, Linda, for a great presentation. My question is, you made the comment that in your study, you used at first a low incentive payment and then a higher incentive payment. With the low incentive payment, you said 1% adoption or takers for trying cover crops. And then you said we tried a higher incentive payment and still only 5% of takers. And your conclusion was that non-monetary factors are at work. And my question is, how do you know your incentive payment simply wasn't high enough to cover the costs and the risks?
Well, we certainly don't know if it's covering the risks, right? But it more than covered the costs. So our second incentive payment was offering, for those of you in farming world, was offering $5,000 for 30 acres of cover crops, which is a lot of money. And so it's way more than any government program is able to provide. So at some point, we could keep experimenting and increasing, $10,000, $20,000, but it becomes a little impractical to keep experimenting that way, right? Because there's no way you can scale that up. So maybe at some point you reach a magic threshold where you have offered enough money to really offset all of the other attitudinal norms, all of those other barriers. But I think it becomes a really hypothetical, not very realistic exercise.
One quick question, Rochelle.
Yeah, Linda, I would just like to comment that as far as the crop insurance issue, USDA RMA fully supports cover crops. And actually in 2020 was the first year that they implemented the practice that you do not have to terminate cover crop the date of planting your insured crop. So I hope that becomes a widespread communication moving forward, because that should not be an issue.
Yeah. No, thank you, Rochelle. That's what our data show as well. And thank you for those for being much more specific about how they've improved the crop insurance program. I appreciate that.
Well, Linda, thank you. And we'll give you the Zoom thank you in all of this. We appreciate your comments and insights into the decision-making process and adoption. So now we're going to transition into a series of what we call flash talks. These are going to be for a length of 7 minutes each. Speakers, be aware that in the chat, you'll be given a 2-minute warning to wrap up and everything. But these are different snippets of our technologies and what we have available to this. So I think you'll find these very fascinating, and we'll reserve all the time for questions and dialogue until after all the speakers have talked this afternoon. So with that, I'm going to start off by asking Bruno Basso from Michigan State University to talk about digital agriculture to reduce nitrogen losses across the U.S. Corn Belt. So Bruno, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Jerry, and thank you, the academies and the organizer for this beautiful workshop. It's truly a privilege to share with you some of the latest findings that my lab has been working on. As you mentioned, Jerry, this really deals with digital agriculture, perhaps to the next level, because the goal is to scale up what we've been finding on a farm level. Move the screen, yes. So often digital agriculture is associated with obviously sensors on machinery, and yield mapping is one of those. And this is an example of a yield map, and obviously the difficulties of a farmer to be able to make a decision by seeing this spatial pattern that do not stay constantly over time. So there is a spatial temporal dimension. And so the possibility of analyzing these yield maps into an historical perspective led us to combine these differences between pixels, between space and variation over time, to identify what we call areas that they have a consistent pattern of high productivity, a medium or constantly underperforming, or even areas that they do well some years and not in others. And I have had the opportunity and the privilege to be able to use a substantial amount of yield maps. We've been working with 7,400 high quality yield maps that were shared by farmers, high quality information. And some of these maps are over 10 years of data on many fields across different crops. In addition to the yield maps, we have digital imagery. As you see there, one interesting finding more recently is the use of thermal imagery relate to the same principle of sea variation in temperature and canopy temperature into a thermal stability map. And if you see, I picked those fields as being the same to show the very close proportionality of areas high and stable and being cooler, basically availability of water and satisfying the evaporative demand, versus areas that they're much more dependent on, rainfall rather than a deep soil with a greater water holding capacity. And so that's coming together and it's helping us to separate water stress from nitrogen stress that is much more done with optical sensing. So not having, not be happy enough with a great data set, we needed to scale. And so a few years ago, my lab and I have been working on this scalability approach using imagery and using the same principle, basically using Landsat imagery. So the resolution is higher, but it's across a 80 million acres of the Corn Belt, because 70 million was the first study, but we're adding new states. And so now you can basically learn about every single field, because we used common land unit, and basically understand the variation within the subfield using the thresholds of either two-way outliers, where 1 point flips from one area, from low to high, or remains in the same category. And so we have a possibility of understanding that, and the analysis led to this pretty tremendous finding of, the low and stable areas as basically the areas losing most of the nitrogen, because it's not necessarily nitrogen, not used efficiently, but rather the lack of water that is not coupling the uptake and the supply. So we have done an analysis in terms of economics, the energy emitted, and the CO2 into the atmosphere. So we have, again, for every tile, we will have a field that is a surplus, the cost. What we also worked on for, again, this 70 million, it seems a little bit crazy, but it is for every single field that is available to be seen actually on a website. We partition the areas that they're more vulnerable to water deficit, the hilltops, the sloping land, versus areas where water tends to accumulate. And this is a work that Rafael Martinez and I, my postdoc, have recently published in scientific reports. And we showed that within the same year, the field is either some parts of the field that is, if the year is more on the dry side, the water deficit vulnerable areas will have a reduction, and the depression areas will be the only one doing a good yield, and vice versa. As the rainfall, the anomalies of the rainfall, as rainfall increases, you will have water accumulating, giving a reduction in the depression rather than an increase instead on the deficit, water deficit area. So we've been scaling, and there is basically more than 5 million acres that they are vulnerable to the same situation within the same field every year, with that level of reduction that you see, nearly 33% of the yield. So the other thing is we've been analyzing all these zones, and some of this work has been published, some is coming out really right at this moment. We learned also, because of this valuable data set and the scalability approach, that these low and stable areas tend to be on the edges of the field, because we've shown with the yield mapping technology, as you move away from the field, the yield tend to be better in the middle of the field. And so again, not worrying about just the producers that share the data, we scaled through the remote sensing, knowing exactly where these areas are, but also going one step forward and being more pragmatic, which means we analyze the pixels that they are contiguous and to a size big enough that could really be implemented either a variable rate of some kind of reductions, or even a precision conservation, as you will see. So either what are the fraction of low and stable areas that they are on the edge of the field, or what are the areas that they are greater than 1 acre that they are in the middle of the field. And so the core of trying to answer some of the question on this workshop, this work really leads to what we could, I guess, call, a sustainable intensification of these fields, where variable rate comes in by understanding where nitrogen could be reduced in case farmers are not willing to use a precision conservation approach, where you'll see probably, hopefully, the numbers. The blue map is the nitrogen that is applied with NAS and obviously the data that we had. If you were to implement based on the nitrogen use efficiency and the responses of water availability and more complicated analysis, you'll see that you could reduce the amount of fertilizer applied, which converts into a climate benefit. The next map that I'm not showing here, it's basically carbon credits that could be verified from this sort of approach from the machinery. So nitrogen precision conservation is not having any of this corn being grown on these low productivity areas, rather native vegetation. And I have a series of scenarios that I'll go really quickly across, but here you will have a significant saving as you see here. So if you bear with me, just on the right side of the column, you have these low and stable areas that they are partitioned in the total acreage in hectares. Middle means the greater areas of 1 acre that they are in the middle of the field, at least not on the edge of the field, versus the one that are low-hanging fruit, to be able to put things on the edges of the field. And so we could lead to the reduction that is actually the nitrogen that ends up in the Mississippi River of 1.1 teragrams, or just by having precision conservation only on the edges of the field if farmers were not willing to change things, even the big enough areas so they could, but in that case would be 0.3 teragrams. So the other thing is we have shown that these areas are not just low productivity, but unprofitable. And so if you see the map of the one on the left is a yield map of 1 year, that's converted. This is non-uncertain analysis. This is data coming from the expenses. We have just about anything from these farmers except their bank account because it's red and I don't want anything to deal with that. And so the yield map below, the stability map for 11 years and 7 years of corn shows more of a stunning picture of basically a lot of this land being unproductive. And so we've been using several scenarios, including one of possibility of using cover crops. There is a limitation. There is a need and cost of growing cover crops on fields. And so these areas could be allocated for seeds to be planted within the same farm. And so that's the low and stable areas that they are only on the edges of the field, contiguous. Or what is the impact of changing the biocontrol, which is a more extensive work, and just want to show the changes of composition in grassland from current to basically changing these areas to native strips. In the end, we have the critical thing. I would agree with some of the statement that Ken Castleman gave last week, a brilliant presentation, but one of the things is models are actually pretty close and they do understand the processes of what happens. The major limitation more often deals with the capacity of capturing spatial variability, which is certainly not necessarily captured if you were to go and measure it everywhere, because that's still not sustainable. So the approach of linking the remotely sensed use plants as indicator, the figure up there shows if you were to run a soil, yield map, a simulation using soils versus, stability map, as you're seeing here, the performance of the model are completely different, where the model will say the soil is good, the yield should be higher, when instead the plant, that area really actually flooded. So I'll conclude by showing that this is scalable now with this analysis of corn profit and the pretty sad picture of how much money these farmers lose on these areas. And in conclusion, this is in a paper that John Antol and I published recently on Nature Sustainability, where you got the sensors used critical to detect variability, parameterized model, remote sensing to get this stability analysis, and then profitability lays at the center to show farmers in terms of adoption. You can push the envelope in areas where there is a response. You should change your mind about growing corn in low productivity areas, all integrated into a system approach to increase the circularity of energy, water quality, profitability, and eventually lead to a policy as the new administration is actually looking for. So with that, I thank again very much for the invitation, and this work wouldn't be possible without the funding agency and this great group of kids working in my lab. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Bruno. And next we're going to move to Alejandro Pesina to talk about cover crops by region, the good, the bad, and the ugly in the Midwest. So Alejandro, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Jerry. And as soon as we have the slides ready to go. Thank you. Okay, so I'm an economist by training. I will discuss the economic implications of cover crops. Next, please. So before getting there, let's see what a cover crop is and Linda showed a picture of that. Now to the left, we see that a cover crop is a plant that covers the soil between cash crops. And it can be a winter cover crop or a summer cover crop. We'll focus on winter cover crops. And the idea of using cover crops, particularly here in Iowa and the Midwest, is to improve water quality, to improve soil health, and particularly reduce soil erosion under high precipitation events and avoid the kind of disaster that we see on the picture to the right. It's not really clear at this point whether cover crops are a good option to manage weeds, insects, and other pests. But there's science behind the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy, and that report puts cover crops as a reasonable strategy to reduce nitrogen load by 29% and phosphorus load going into water streams by 28%. So that's the good about cover crops, right? That's the mostly related to the environmental benefits related to cover crops. Now, as Linda anticipated, the adoption rate is the bad, because in Iowa in particular, we only have a 4% rate of adoption, according to the 2017 Census of Ag. That was a huge increase from the 2012 Census of Ag, when that was only 1%. But that's not limited to Iowa. Next, please. This picture at the top shows a very low rate of adoption in most states. Michigan leads the pack with 9%, but in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, the top corn, soybean producing states, we have very low rates of adoption, way lower than 10%. So the question is, why is the adoption rate so low in these states? And I will summarize it from the economic standpoint. And that's mainly because in crop-only production systems, cover crops are not profitable for most farmers. And that's the ugly part. So I will show the results from 3 studies that to support this claim. I understand that the economics are not the only reason, but it's a major reason behind this low rate of adoption. We talked about cost share payments to incentivize the use of cover crops and how limited they are in time and in volume. And it's true that cost share payments actually reduce the or offset to some extent the costs of implementing cover crops among program participants, which are not all cover crop adopters, but only few, even among those who use cost share to offset the cost of implementing cover crops, only a few of those experience positive net returns on an annual basis out of cover crops. Now, once we incorporate cows, livestock, but cows in particular, let's say dairy or cow calf or even a feedlot, if we have a mixed livestock crop system, then cover crops can become profitable under the right conditions. So what are the right conditions? If you think of the benefits that cover crops, winter cover crops, can generate on the livestock system, that will really depend on the volume, on the amount of above ground biomass that the cover crops generate in early spring. So it has to be enough at a good, at the proper timing to actually save on feeding costs for the livestock operation. But it's not just that. Cover crops have to be near the feedlot or near the barn where the cows are. And there are many other things that need to click in order for cover crops to be profitable on an annual basis, even with livestock. But if anything, a farmer who is able to grow cover crops with livestock and receives some cost share payments, that's the farmer most likely to obtain positive net returns on an annual basis. So the three studies that I will discuss next, please, are based on partial budgets. So we compare the differences in costs and revenue from a system with corn following fallow, nothing planted in the winter, versus the profit in a system with corn following cover crops in the winter. And this is for the same producer. Next, please. The first analysis is coming from a regional online survey, and the average extra cost here about $36 per acre, and that's mostly planting cover crops, seeds and planting costs, and then the extra termination costs, about $36 on average. The average cost share payments received by farmers are about $26. And these respondents came up with a $2 on average yield drag for corn and a yield improvement for soybeans that resulted in a net return -21 for corn and +25 for soybeans. But that's driven mainly by the cost share payments. If we take out the cost share payments, now we're down to -$46 per acre on a corn system and -$3 per acre on a soybean system. Next, please. We extended the analysis with a mailed survey statewide in Iowa, and this was financed by CARD. Kathy supported this project back in 2017, and we had an average, a median, in this case, a median extra cost of $35, a median payment from cost share between 15 and 20, and the net returns, including the cost share payments, were negative between $15 and $19 per acre. Only if we included feed cost savings on the livestock enterprise, then net returns would go into the positive side. Next, please. And this is a study based on agronomic experimental fields with 324 data points, and the average, as you can see, I won't go into the details, but the average net returns calculated on these experimental fields are negative for both years, fall 18 and fall 19. Next, please. And I will conclude my presentation by saying that cover crops are still a crop, and therefore they depend on weather, they depend on soil, they depend on several conditions. And if there's a little biomass, or that biomass is of low quality, then the net returns to the farmer tend to be very small to negative. Now, not only that, I want to point out that cover crops are listed, are ranked 11th and 12th in the nitrogen, in the nutrient reduction strategy. So that means that there are 10 other practices more likely to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus loads, and that, both at the state level and federal level, there are plenty of cost share programs subsidizing cover crops, and I'm not sure about the effectiveness. Well, effectiveness is low, the efficiency, and also the additionality. And we are missing here long-term effects of using cover crops, but the monetization of soil health and carbon sequestration are really limited today by the disagreement on soil health metrics. And without the metrics, it's really hard to put a dollar value to that long-term improvement. So with that, I will stop here, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Alejandro, thank you. And now we'll transition to talking about using integrated prairie to restore ecosystem health. It's a little follow-on from even a concept that Bruno brought out, looking at vulnerable parts of that field. So I'll turn it over to Lisa Schulte-Moore.
Thank you, Jerry. And it's a real honor to be able to present today and follow on last week's talk, as well as the talks earlier today. It's a fantastic workshop. So So I'll be talking about strategically integrating prairie and prairie strips. Next slide. And first of all, for those of you that aren't familiar, what are prairie strips? They were defined now through USDA for the first time in 2019 as diverse perennial vegetation oriented linearly within crop fields. They may not exceed more than 25% of the cropland area of the field, and they range in width between 30 and 120 feet, and they can have some equipment traffic on them. Next slide. And what we know about prairie strips has largely been generated through the STRIPS project, which I am a member of. STRIPS includes about 12 different institutions and dozens of investigators and students. And we've been looking at this concept of strategically integrating prairie into crop fields for well over a decade now, and have published about 39 papers now on the concept, in addition to master's theses and dissertations from the students. Next slide. And we've studied this both in experimental catchments at a pretty small scale, next slide, as well as in commercial scale operations and on commercial fields, as you see in this picture, next, and this picture, next, and this picture. Dr. Kling wanted some pretty pictures, so I've included them in here for you. Next slide. And what we found in terms of highlights over a decade of research have been many. I'm going to focus what I present here, though, on those I think that are most relevant to the discussion of the workshop, which includes some of the results that we've generated with regards to nitrogen moving with water runoff, as well as through subsurface flow and conversion to N2 gas through microbial processes. Next slide. And I'll focus on 7 main points that I think are most relevant for this audience. And next slide. The first one being that prairie strips can substantially reduce nitrate loss when they are placed on untiled fields where the shallow groundwater can interact with the prairie root zone. And we've shown this in some of the papers from our initial experimental work, and now some data here from Matt Helmer's lab. Matt presented in last week's workshop, showing this importance of this interaction with the prairie root system. So what you're seeing here is 2 groundwater wells located just 20 to 30 feet apart. The upslope is at the edge of on the upper edge of the strip, and the lower one is at the lower edge of the strip. And we can see, while it's variable across time and certainly site, that there tends to be a decrease in that nitrogen, that nitrate concentration in groundwater, even over a very short spatial scale, over a very short extent with the prairie strips. Next slide. Secondly, that the nitrate intercepted at the foot slope can be fully denitrified to N2. And these are data from Javed Iqbal, who's now at University of Nebraska, and Mike Castellano at Iowa State, showing again that that nitrous oxide emissions are variable across time and space, but that prairie emits much less nitrous oxide than corn and soybean, the corn treatment here, and that when the prairie strips are located that foot slope position in the lower diagram, there's actually negative emissions. And so thus we know, one, that prairie strips, we can completely denitrify that nitrogen with the prairie strips. And so we're not trading a water quality problem with an air quality problem with prairie strips. Next slide. So what do we do about tiled fields? Because we know that water in tiled is just being shunted by the prairie strip. And in that case, we would suggest that farmers combine practices and implement a saturated buffer at the edge of the field along with the prairie strip. And here are some data from Dan Janes from USDA and Tom Eisenhart showing the ability of saturated buffers to remove nitrate from tile water. And if the strip is, on the order of that 30 or 40 or 50 feet, we can remove most of that nitrate, even from the tile water if it's paired with a saturated buffer. Next slide. And then the additionality piece that Alejandro just mentioned, cover crops have a lot of great benefits. So do prairie strips. We know that prairie strips can help us reduce the flow of water off of farm fields. We can reduce sediment loss from farm fields. We can start to accrue carbon beneath those prairie strips. We provide bird habitat, pollinator habitat, and prairie strips help improve honeybee health. Next slide. We also know that prairie strips are one of the most cost-effective conservation practices that farmers can implement on their fields. And these are data from John Tyndall showing that if a prairie strip is if paired with the Conservation Reserve Program, the cost per treated acre is around $7 for that treated acre of farm field. Next slide. And similar to what Bruno has found, John's work hasn't yet accounted for crop acres that are actually losing money for farmers. And so if we are, again, able to put this native prairie vegetation on areas that are not pulling their weight financially, we have an opportunity for a win-win for farmers and society. Next slide. We also know from data from Jerry Arbuckle, extension sociologist at Iowa State, that farmers are increasingly more accepting of prairie strips. And in recent survey data, farmers, over half of farmers said they had heard of prairie strips, they want to learn more, and they may consider putting prairie strips on their farms. We know that when paired with CRP, acceptance of or consideration for putting prairie strips on their fields increases by 47%. And prairie strips has just been a part of CRP for 13 months now. And those figures on the bottom, you can see the adoption rate over just this last 13-month period. Next slide. And lastly, we also know from a choice experiment conducted last year by Karina Schoengold and Badri Khanel from University of Nebraska that Iowans are willing to pay for the benefits associated with prairie strips, and especially nutrient removal. Based on this choice experiment, Iowans suggested that they were willing to pay $241 one-time payment for a 30-year span for the benefits that they would accrue through prairie strips. Next slide. And that's it. So I just wanted to also thank my collaborators, our funders, and other partners. My contact information is there, or else I'll meet you on Slack. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, we're going to move from prairie strips to water management, and it's my pleasure to welcome Jim Sheppers to talk about infield water management in Nebraska. So, Jim. You're on mute right now. So
yeah.
There
Are we
go.
okay?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jerry, and the organization crew that put this thing together. Next slide, please. If you look at this picture, this map, it looks like the state of Nebraska and the landscape looks like a pincushion with all the punctures by 100,000 or more irrigation wells. Now, the interesting thing is that there's about 55,000 center pivot irrigation systems that are linked to these irrigation wells. And now if you go and string these out end to end, you've got a really long string of pipe. Next slide. In the case of many of these wells, they're also set up for chemigation so that farmers can inject pesticides or fertilizer into these wells. And the point being here is that once you've taken a lot of the risk of drought out of the system, you now have the ability to come in and start thinking about other things like the stability of production, cover crops, other things that we've already heard about. But you need to be ready to step it up in terms of the management level and also the time commitment. You need to be ready to react throughout the growing season. Next slide. Where does the water come from? Well, we have two major aquifers. The Ogallala one is that it's deeper, it's quite clean, and the one people mostly know about. But it's the Platte River aquifer, that goes across the state that's the one that attracts all the attention, because this is a source of domestic well water for many, many people. And the point I would mention here is that in 1995, we sampled and put a date on the age of the water. The water table was at about 15 feet. The age of the water was about 3 months old at the top of the aquifer. At the bottom of the aquifer, about 60 feet, it was 19 years old. So in essence, what we're doing is loading the top of the aquifer with new water and also new nitrate compared to the bottom. One of the farmers says, it looks like we're storing nitrate in the groundwater for our children. Next slide. This is a typical situation then of monthly rainfall compared to the need for water for evapotranspiration. Until about the first week or two in June, precipitation is greater than the evaporative need for corn. And so we have a potential for nitrate leaching. Once you get to mid-June, now we're to the point of needing water. And so we have a good chance of controlling and managing water. This also means that we can put nitrogen in the water if and when needed. So the strategy is cut down on the amount of early season nitrogen and be ready to fix it and to even play catch up if you need to by side dressing or fertigating. Next slide. Don't need many words for this slide, but the point being that if you're in the mode to spoon feed the crop, you really reduce the potential for losses. The only constriction here is that if you're spoon feeding the crop, you need to know when it's hungry and how much to feed it. Next slide. So this is sort of symbolic of a dipstick, some way to monitor this crop to tell when it needs more nitrogen. Now we can get a long ways by using computer models or simulations and know about when and how much nitrogen is going to be required. But the crop is really a good biological indicator in itself and can be used and can be done with chlorophyll meters or crop canopy sensors, remote sensing, this sort of thing. Next slide. The thing I didn't talk about is that corn plants behave like a pig, like me in a salad bar or dessert bar, that if there's extra nitrogen in the soil, it's going to take it up and store it in the lower stalk. This acts as a reserve, but we don't know how much is in that plant, and there's no convenient way to monitor this crop short of destructively sampling it to figure out how much reserve we have. So we really have to stay on top of things and use sensors, SPAD meters, something like this to tell us when we're getting close to the point of needing to put some more fertilizer in the water. Next slide. So as we think about extracting and extending what we might have learned from irrigation studies in Nebraska, we look for the easy button or the free lunch. When I was asked to make this presentation, I started talking to some consultants that I know, and they said, well, just build on the basics, keep it pretty simple. And they offered two ideas. Next slide. The first one goes back to the early 1990s. They said, you guys showed us a picture of a bare soil after planting corn, and you also showed us a map of the organic matter that was generated by sampling several months earlier. The patterns are very similar. One was expensive, one was inexpensive. So the consultant said, what we do, we look at the color map of the soil, we do some smart sampling, and from that, we put those values of organic matter content into the Nebraska algorithm that contains an organic matter correction, and we make variable rate nitrogen applications either pre-plant or at side dress time. And then late in the season, we follow up with chemigation or use a high clearance sprayer to take care of any problems. Next slide. In this case, it also involves color. But in this case, I said, remember when you guys were spoon feeding the crops? And what you had done was reduce the nitrogen rate on the field by about 25%. But you put these high nitrogen strips in the field as an indicator so that you could see what was happening and when it might be time to put more fertilizer in the system. At this time, we were using chlorophyll meters to determine whether we needed more nitrogen in the system. But the same sort of thing would also work if you had manure. So you could have a high manure strip, and that would even perhaps tell you what particular nutrient was wrong if you saw a side-by-side comparison. Very briefly, just think what could be done if you were in a mode to put a low nitrogen strip in the field. That would provide a really early warning of the need to stay on top of things and make some corrections and be ready to take an action. And finally, the last slide, it goes back to Nebraska, and we have what they call natural resources districts. But these folks have a taxing authority. On our land out there, we pay about $3 an acre, and farmers are able to use these funds for cost sharing activities if they're related to improving water management or new kinds of devices like drip irrigation or flow meters, these sort of things. The other thing that this particular natural resource district in blue is able to do, they've been doing this since 1988. And so depending on the nitrate level in the groundwater, they've said there will not be any more fall application of nitrogen fertilizer. And now if you see somebody out in the fall, a telephone call, and the guy's done. But what the farmers are required to do is to test their soil and water, report how much nitrogen and water they apply, and at the end of the year record yield, turn this information into the Natural Resources District. And so they have a record now going back to 1988 of production records for all these fields. It's been summarized a couple times, but it needs to be done again because in the recent years, many of these fields originally were under furrow irrigation are now under center pivot irrigation. So maybe the ideas of using soil color and cost sharing dollars from natural resource districts and this sort of thing may give other locations and other people an idea how they might move forward to improve nitrogen management, even though they don't have control of the water. Thanks now.
Thank you. All right, we're going to move to a different aspect of water, over to Jane Frankenberg to talk about management of nitrogen in tile drain systems. So, Jane?
Okay, I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about ways that we can reduce nitrogen in tile drained lands. Are my slides showing? Should I go ahead? Okay, for those who might not be familiar with these systems, my slides, when they come up, will show images across the bottom. There we are, that show different components of the system, the installation on the left, and a newly installed field in the middle, and an outlet at the right. Okay, I'll just keep talking. Nobody knows exactly the extent of tile drainage. And the 2017 Ag Census reported 56 million acres, most in the Midwest. And that little tool that you can barely see on the right there is a tool that we developed on the right so that users can explore likely drained land based on the soil and crop characteristics. Next slide. All right, there we go. Okay, so tile drain systems are key because they do tend to have quite high nitrate loads. The Transforming Drainage Project has brought together data being collected by scientists across the Midwest, and nitrate loads in the conventional drainage systems that we've monitored are shown in the graph at right. You can see that the blue dots, which represent the average at each site, range from 18 to 59 kilograms per hectare in these 11 systems. So that's pretty high for people in other parts of the country. Next slide. So what are the options for reducing the nitrogen losses? Well, researchers are working on this critical question all across the Midwest and beyond. As extension specialists, the colleagues listed below and I synthesized the various methods into 10 and developed an extension publication that clearly lays out the 10 main ways that are being researched and used, at least a little. And this publication can easily be found on the web, but I'm going to use it as the basis here. So we included a simplified nitrogen cycle shown in the center that shows the inputs, the outputs to the plants, which is what we want, and outputs to the water, which we want to avoid. We also clarified 4 processes that these practices enable in various ways. And we think this helps to understand what each of the practices can do. Next slide. So I'm going to quickly run through the 10 practices in my 7 minutes. And for each one, the slide shows what it is, how it works to reduce nitrogen loss, and then some issues regarding its adoption. Obviously, this will be very quick. So I'll start with managing nitrogen fertilizer. The 4 R's are widely encouraged, and I think we'll hear more about it. The rate is usually based on the economically optimum nitrogen rate. And obviously, if we get the right rate and right timing, we can reduce the excess nitrogen source available for leaching. And applying it at the right time can increase plant uptake. So that's 2 of the processes. But I do want to emphasize, as far as adoption, that the economically optimum rates may not be the environmentally optimum rates, and also that there's great difficulty in knowing in advance how much to apply. Next slide. The second way is to plant cover crops in the winter, which work by increasing plant uptake of nitrogen and also reducing drain flow. They've got a lot of other benefits, but there are adoption challenges, as we've just heard, because there are costs and effort that limit their adoption. Next slide. So the third practice is to add perennials to the cropping system, and potential crops in our area include grass and legumes planted for pasture, as well as bioenergy crops, which at one point we thought would make a bigger impact, but unfortunately, all of these have been limited by lack of markets and infrastructure. So although we'd love to see more perennials, adoption is limited. Next slide. So next we'll turn to practices that modify the drainage system. The first is controlled drainage, also known as drainage water management. And in this practice, an adjustable water control structure is placed in the drainage system to raise or lower the outlet. The top image shows that after harvest, when drainage is not needed, the outlet can be raised, which reduces drain flow through the winter. It needs to be lowered before field work in the spring. So the adoption issues include the cost of installation and also that operating the gates takes time. They need to be adjusted in spring and fall to achieve the water quality benefits. And there are yield benefits to adjusting them more often. And automation is being developed, but that of course raises the cost. Next slide. The next potential practice is to change the spacing or depth of the drains, which changes the drainage intensity. More widely spaced drains would reduce drain flow and nitrate load. As for adoption, however, typical drainage installations are moving in the opposite direction. The spacing is actually getting narrower and narrower, increasing the nitrate load. And the increases in precipitation in the Midwest due to climate change, of course, is making narrower spacing more likely in the future. Next slide. A very consequential practice would be what we call drainage water recycling, which is storing drained water in a reservoir and using it as irrigation later in the season. It requires a quite large reservoir, as the 2 reservoirs on the left show, one in Michigan and one in Missouri, but it could have a very strong impact on nutrient loads by reapplying the lost nitrogen onto the field where it's needed. Adoption of this practice is still very low, as it's very expensive, both because of the land taken out of production for the reservoir and for the construction costs. But there's a new NRCS conservation practice standard that may support this more and more in Midwest states. Next slide. Denitrifying bioreactors made by filling trenches with wood chips, where the biological process of denitrification can take place, is the 7th practice. I'll go very quickly. This has great potential, but no yield benefit, so relies on farmers wanting to be good stewards or having good cost share programs. Next slide. We're up to number 8. Constructed wetlands are quite well known. This is the first practice that works through 3 processes. So I think that shows the strength of practices like this that have multiple benefits. But adoption challenges include especially the cost of taking land out of production. Next slide. We could also modify the ditches that tiles drain into. In 2-stage ditches, a floodplain is added within the ditch, and that creates a zone for plant uptake and denitrification. It also works through 3 processes, as these small floodplains could be considered to be linear wetlands. And like other practices, the adoption is limited by the cost of the land needed for this practice. Next slide. And the final practice is saturated buffers. So as many people know, riparian buffers can be a good thing, but in tile drain systems, they're typically bypassed by the tile running under them and not benefiting from the plants in the buffer. And in a saturated buffer, researchers figured out that if the water leaves the drain and saturates the buffer, there's an opportunity for denitrification. And this is done through directing the drainage water into a perforated tile, where if the topography is right, it will leave the tile and saturate the soil. So this has been shown to work very well in appropriate locations, but again, there are no yield benefits, so other incentives would need to be provided. Next slide. So in this very brief run through, I hope you've seen that we have nitrogen reduction options, and these all work to varying extents, but they all have costs. So engineers and others keep trying to think of different ways to manipulate the water in plants to reduce nutrient loads, but all our options are likely to continue to have costs. So I want to conclude with a reflection about adoption that may seem obvious, but I think needs to be said, which is that today's incentives have resulted in today's nitrogen losses. And that if we want to make a change, we need to change the incentives. I think research and extension can make a difference. And although I'm a research and extension specialist working hard on that, I think we need to assume that we will actually need to shift the incentives. And I hope that this study can result in some impacts in that way. Thank you again for allowing me the opportunity to present these thoughts.
Thank you, Jane. And Jane has brought up the 4 R's, and we're going to switch over to Carrie Vollmer-Sanders to talk about the 4 R's of nutrient management. So Carrie?
Thank you, Jerry. And I'm going to talk about a little bit more than the 4 R's. So I work for the Nature Conservancy, and the Nature Conservancy, if you're not familiar with us, it's a private nonprofit whose mission is to conserve the land in which all life depends. And when we think about the 4 R's, I immediately think of the Fertilizer Institute, Fertilizer Canada, and the International Plant Nutrition Institute, who initiated the 4 R's. So I thought I would talk about how we're helping implement the 4 R's, and that is through a 4R certification program. And if you go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about what those 4 R's are. They've been mentioned a few times. So the 4 R's refer to the right source of fertilizer at the right rate, putting it in the right place and at the right time. But it's underpinned with this fact that it's not just the economic drivers, but it's also the environmental and social drivers that matter. And you can find more information going to the nutrientstewardship.org website. But there's also been some research that's been conducted bringing together folks to determine what the beginning, intermediate, and advanced 4 R's of nutrient stewardship are, because they're different for different regions and different systems. I'll also say that when you think about the 4 R's holistically, it's not just those nutrient management practices that you think of maybe in field, like what I just mentioned, but also it's how those work in combination with other practices. Like if we incorporate the nutrients, does that change the rate? When you add blind inlets or wetlands, how might those 4Rs that we mentioned just a minute ago change? So they need to work holistically. And when you think about implementing the 4Rs, Robin Wilson did some research, and as we might guess, the farmers need to believe that those practices are going to be effective if they're going to adopt those practices. Next slide, please. So I think Linda touched on this really well at the onset. Farmers trust their crop advisors in two different perspectives. They trust their crop advisors for even when you're thinking about conservation practices, and when you think about nutrient stewardship or nutrient recommendations. So the science shows that farmers listen to those sources of information. So when you think about how many farmers a crop advisor might touch, anywhere from 10 to 300, and the ripple effect, how many acres those farmers manage, then you get to think about, all right, how do we engage these crop advisors to really implement the 4Rs of nutrient stewardship? If you go to the next slide, please. So that's why one of the reasons we created this certification program. It is to not only think about the education, but also the implementation, to make sure that we're actually implementing those 4R practices. And we started this program in the Western Lake Erie Basin. It has grown beyond that, but I will say that the way we've structured the program, we can consistently agree on what the right 4Rs are for that particular geography. Right now, we've been moving in states or provinces and working really closely with the agribusiness association in that state or province to help administer the program. But each geography has to do a few things. One is create a governing body, a council for that area, and a technical or science committee. And that stewardship council needs to be a diverse set of partners, as you can see here. But that group reviews the science. They develop the geographic specific standards that are based on the global standards that have 15 different pieces to them. And each state or province to date has created about between 30 and 40 standards to meet those 15 global standards, because they need to be state specific, geography specific. But once that geography creates the standards, then it needs to be approved by that global council. And then audits can occur. Typically, those are annual audits to make sure that that nutrient service provider, that crop advisor, is not only following those 4Rs for that geography, giving the right advice, but they're also applying the fertilizer in accordance with those 4Rs, and they're educating the growers that they're working with. And I'll also point out that the standards are reviewed annually. Should any new science come up or new practice be discussed, then they can alter the standard accordingly. Next slide. The difficulty can sometimes be agreeing on what the right 4Rs might be. And I'll just point out a few things. We launched the first certification program after we were developing it for 2 years, and we did not have nitrogen in that list very often. It took a whole nother year of reviewing the science and discussing amongst the select, a smaller group, to bring it back to the larger group to add in specific items for nitrogen. And we also had to define some words, which has been interesting. So thinking about frozen ground, what does frozen mean? Is it frozen in the morning? What if it's frozen just for a few hours and then it's not frozen? So we had a lot of discussion to make sure that we not only understood and agreed to the science, but we defined those tricky terms. Frozen, by the way, means that you cannot till the soil for the next 48 hours. Next slide, please. Robin Wilson and colleagues they did some surveys with farmers. It was the same farmers in 2016 as in 2018. And this slide here, or graphic, shows that farmers that were working with 4R certified providers always or never, or they were working with a 4R certified provider in the in 2018, but not in 2016, what was their change or adoption of 4R practices? And you can see here that when comparing those, we can see that certification may be both increasing knowledge and behavior change among their farmer customers, likely not due entirely because of the increased prevalence of hearing about the principles, but it also might be a result of consistent prompts, reminders, and the availability of support that working with the 4R certified providers provides. Another interesting outcome is that we have a sense of pride by many certified providers with posting their signs on the front of their buildings, developing signage on their trucks or for their farmers so that they can showcase that they are 4R certified. Next slide, please. I would encourage you all to go to the 4R certified website and see more information. We have impacted 4 million acres to date, with 2 states just starting their certifications this spring. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation.
Thanks, Carrie. And we're going to transition now. It's been mentioned a number of times, but we need some technology. So I'm going to turn it over to David Lee to talk about technology to measure nitrogen levels. So David?
Great. Thanks, Jerry. I hope I've unmuted myself in all the different variations I have. And I want to thank you and all the organizers for inviting me to give an overview here. I'll be presenting on some of the programs that the Department of Energy's Advanced Research Project Agency has funded over the past few years. For those of you not familiar with RPE, it's a funding agency within the DOE focused on high-risk applied research, and I happen to be a technical contractor for the agency. So I'm in a great position of being able to give an overview of some of the programs and individual projects that our great research teams have worked on relevant to nitrogen sensing on farms. Move to the next slide. So we often get asked, why is RPE funding research in ag? And so I have to highlight a number of energy-related impacts of agriculture, both as a consumer of energy and natural resources and as a provider. Here are some of the estimated impacts and some of the various programs over the past 5 years that RPE has stood up. The Terra and Roots programs were focused on developing tools, phenotyping tools to enable the better development of intense crops, which could require less water and nitrogen. And our new Smart Farm program is focused on quantifying the baseline of GHG fluxes in agricultural environments. If you move to the next slide, we looked at essentially quantifying the carbon intensity of crop production. And as been previously discussed, the use of nitrogen fertilizer has a large energy cost. We worked with Argonne National Lab to quantify the carbon intensity of the nitrogen component in seed crop production, both in terms of the production and the volatilization. As you may know, nitrous oxide is estimated to be a greenhouse gas about 300 times more potent than CO2. So being able to reduce the amount of nitrogen being used and the amount being volatilized could have very large impacts. And we also felt that this could provide new incentives for sustainable practices by being able to tie in crop production with carbon intensity, which is utilized by some regulatory agencies, for example, to determine whether a low carbon fuel qualifies for incentives. If you move to the next slide. We always like this picture, and always have to thank Jerry Glover when he was at the Land Institute, because it really illustrates the challenge of understanding what's going on below ground and the need for better sensing tools. This is also true of measuring volatiles such as N2O in the field. And if you go to the next slide, was some of the justification for our new Smart Farm program. This program is intended to develop some of the tools and models to better understand the levels of GHG fluxes and soil carbon in agricultural fields. And it's split into 2 phases. First phase is deploying the current state of the art for gas measurements using eddy covariance towers to quantify CO2 and N2O emissions, and high-resolution soil and plant sampling in the fields of active farmers with at least 80 acres. So that's a lot of soil cores. I want to highlight that these projects will be making all this data publicly available with the goal of establishing ground truth sites that researchers, regulatory agencies, anyone can get access to and better understand how these gases and nutrients are scaling up. The phase 2 projects are intended to really demonstrate novel sensors that have the same capabilities as what people are using for the phase 1s, but are scalable and don't require the same level of expertise. These are relatively new program with the phase 1 side of things kicking off almost a year ago, and the phase 2 projects which were just selected last fall. The next slide illustrates where the 4 phase 1 field teams will be collecting data across the country, though we have to acknowledge that due to COVID, there were delays last year in establishing most of these field sites. The sites cover a wide variety of crops, ranging from corn and soybean rotations, which University of Illinois and University of Nebraska are focused on, sorghum, which Oklahoma State is characterizing, and then rice, which is being characterized by ARVA. I'll try to remember to post a link to the project descriptions in the Slack chat so that if you're interested, you can read up a little more about them. In the next slide, I'd like to briefly describe an example of one of the phase 1 projects. This is from the ARVA intelligence team, which is being led by Michael Schopenhauer in collaboration with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. As I mentioned, they're focused on rice production systems, and so they're combining eddy covariance, gas flux data, soil and plant compositional data, and microbiome analysis to develop a model to predict potential improvements in greenhouse gas balances in rice production. And as you can see in the proposed targets, that lists all the different sorts of data types that they're collecting, with the overall goal of helping develop a model that will predict more sustainable production systems that could justify low carbon fuel production of feedstocks. Moving to the next slide is just a snapshot of the phase 2 projects. These were just announced, and really quickly, projects at Princeton and Michigan Aerospace Corporation are going to be developing a perimeter laser-based system for measuring nitrous oxide emissions, and Michigan Aerospace Corporation is developing UAV-based platform. Dagan and the University of Illinois are developing data-driven models to predict the nitrogen fluxes in fields and build on existing models like DNVC. And the website below describes with a little more detail. So lastly, in the following slide, I want to highlight a technology that came out of a project at Iowa State University led by Lian Dong, and it's now being commercialized by a startup called Ingenious Ag. It utilizes a silicon-based microfabrication technique, which is producing microneedles containing nitrate-specific electrodes. And that's going to enable very low-cost production at scale because it's utilizing essentially semiconductor manufacturing. It's been demonstrated that it can measure both in-plant and nitrate levels. So that image in the upper right is essentially a microneedle sensor being stuck into the stalk of a corn plant. In addition to groundwater concentrations of nitrate, which is the bottom image, essentially a pump is collecting some of the groundwater and running it over the microneedle sensor. The table shows that its performance is comparable to existing commercial sensor, but the main advantage is it can operate continuous in the field for weeks at a time. The bottom left chart just shows traces of nitrate concentrations in individual plants over about a month and a half. And as you can see, in some cases, the sensors were able to capture the diurnal nitrate uptake. We and the research team feels that the sensor has applications for field management, crop breeding, and environmental monitoring. And hopefully it'll even help answer the question that Jim brought up earlier on when the plant is running low on its internal nitrogen stores. I'd also like to highlight that one of our other RPE technologies will be presented next week by Ana Reyes on developing a novel soil nitrogen sensor. So the last slide, moving forward, just obviously want to thank all of you. I think I've stayed mostly within time with giving a very quick snapshot of how RPE operates and the sorts of technologies with funding. I want to emphasize that my role and the role of Project Program Director David Babson is really to help connect our technologies with users, both commercial and research. So if anything sounded interesting to you, please reach out to me or David, and we'd be happy to connect you with the relevant PIs if appropriate.
David, thank you. And we're going to transition out of the Midwest to Florida for our next talk to Wendy Graham to talk about the Facets project. So Wendy?
Thank you, Jerry. I appreciate the opportunity to bring you down to Florida where it is 65 and sunny. So I want to talk to you today about a project that is funded by the USDA. It's a coordinated agricultural project with 4 universities, 20 faculty members, and 20 students, grad students, and research scientists. So next slide, please. The overall project vision is to promote the agricultural and silvicultural sustainability in North Florida and South Georgia, while protecting water quantity, quality, and habitat in the upper Floridan aquifer and the springs and rivers it feeds. Next slide, please. For those of you who aren't familiar, the upper Floridan aquifer underlies all of Florida and parts of Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, and it's among one of the largest and most productive aquifers in the world. It's a vital shared resource, provides 10 million people with drinking water, about $9 billion in agriculturally related economic activity. But there is a lot of competition for use of this aquifer between urban, agricultural, forestry, and environmental water uses. And this competition is exacerbated by climate variability, agricultural migration from some of the drought-stricken Western states. And what I want to talk to you about mostly today is the stringent environmental standards that have been established to protect both human health, which I know this workshop is focused on, but also ecosystem health. Next slide, please. Like we've seen in several of the talks today, when we put wells into agricultural fields and measure nitrate concentrations in groundwater, we virtually always see concentrations above the MCL of 10 milligrams per liter. This is an example on the left of a well directly underneath a row crop farm, where despite implementation of best management practices, we're seeing, nitrate concentrations of 20 to 30 milligrams per liter. We've been working on these problems for the 30 years that I've been involved here at University of Florida. But about 10 years ago, Florida established numeric nutrient criteria for groundwater emerging from springs from the Floridan aquifer of 0.35 milligrams per liter. And the graph you see on the bottom left is a time series of nitrate emerging from springs going to something less than 0.1 milligram per liter up until about 1980, then increasing very rapidly to above 2 milligrams per liter. And this is causing disruption of flora and fauna, algae blooms, and although we don't have health issues associated with the algae we're concerned about in the springs, nitrogen triggering harmful algae blooms, which cause health problems, have been talked about before and are of concern other places in the state. So next slide, please. So what our project is aiming to do is bring together scientists and stakeholders to really understand and develop the new knowledge we need to look at the trade-offs between the regional agricultural economy and environmental quality. There's been a long time narrative that we can all win in this game. We have small tweaks in behavior, no economic impact, and we'll get to the environmental quality we want and we'll all be happy. But when you're aiming toward a 0.35 milligram per liter nitrate standard, that's a little iffy. So we hope that together we can understand what changes are needed to both achieve agricultural water security and environmental protection, and help put together the tools, incentive programs, and educational programs for improved decision-making. Next slide, please. The project is a big project, lots of people, lots of moving pieces, and I could talk a long time about it, but I'll just say we have 4 major components. There's a component that's doing on-farm, research farm, BMP research in both Florida and Georgia. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. We're developing a modeling platform to really understand both the water quantity, water quality, yield impacts, economic impacts of different ways to manage individual pieces of land owned by farmers, and then collectively how to manage watersheds to protect the aquifer and receiving water bodies. We're using these models both to look at scenarios with stakeholders, but also we have economists using them in willingness to accept and willingness to pay survey to try to help develop some new incentives to spur changes in behavior. And we have an extension group that's also taking the research results from the BMP research into on-farm. We're developing apps for water and nutrient management that they're demonstrating on farms, in-service training programs for crop consultants and extension agents, as well as water schools for decision makers. Next slide, please. So we mentioned BMP research. It's going on both in Florida and Georgia. In Florida, we're looking at corn, carrot, peanut, and corn cover crop peanut rotations. In Georgia, corn, cotton peanut rotations, looking at fertilizer rates, application methods, and irrigation scheduling methods, use of cover crops, and different tillage methods. And just sort of a key findings are with better application methods, banding, NDVI scheduling. We found that application rates can be reduced by about 1/3 without any change in yield in both Florida and Georgia, and that use of soil moisture sensors and phone apps that use real-time weather with a simplified crop and water balance model reduce water required between 30 and 75%. Next slide, please. In the interest of time, I'll move on, but this is a participatory modeling process. We have people from agriculture, forestry, conservation groups, government, and academia working on this model development. Next slide, please. And we work with this group both to decide what the priority crops are that we want to model based on the field experiments done in part of this project, as well as other existing data, and what the range of management systems are that we would like to explore. So with the stakeholders, we developed this list of production systems on the left, and on the right is the range of management systems that we are modeling, generally going from management system 3, which is sort of a traditional high input practice, to management system 1, which would have the most efficient irrigation using soil moisture sensors, the lowest fertilization rate, and the highest use of cover crops. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have a platform that has both biophysical and economic modeling. We are using SWAT ModFlow as our biophysical model because the groundwater component is so important in this karst aquifer system, and the springs are the ecosystem of concern. And then we have an economic model, but what we're really trying to do is look at the trade-offs between the different management practices, net recharge, net returns to the producer, and net nitrate leached. And that's at the farm scale where the decisions are made. And then advance, please. We're also aggregating, advance again, we're also aggregating it up to the watershed scale so we can see how collective action impacts aquifer flows, spring flows, nitrate concentrations. Next slide, please. So this is really the bottom line. What this is our trade-off plot. We have net recharge to the aquifer on the left, leaching to the aquifer on the x-axis, the various cropping systems we've talked, the management system going from management system 3, which is the conventional practice, through management system 1, which is the most efficient. And you can see as you move from management system 3 to management system 1, in all cases, you reduce the leaching, you increase the net recharge. However, you do decrease the net return. So could you advance 2 times on here, please? So if we're trying to protect the environment, we're moving from the lower left up to the lower right to the upper left. But if we want to improve the net returns, we're moving in the opposite direction. So these are the trade-offs that we're trying to get the stakeholders to understand. And next slide, please. Just to make it a little more relevant to the nitrate standards we're talking about, the current conventional practices are all leaching more than 10 milligrams per liter. And this is borne out by wells that we have underneath these fields. As we move to improved management systems, the most efficient management systems, we do see leaching concentrations drop below 10, but nowhere near the environmental standard that we're also shooting for. So next slide, please. When you aggregate this up into SWOT mod flow, and we do some simple scenario analysis that we're developing with the stakeholders, where everybody uses the most efficient management system 1, versus everybody uses the conventional system, which is management system 3. We do see significant reductions in the nitrate concentrations emerging from the springs, but not enough to achieve the environmental standards. We have a scenario where all agricultural is converted to slash pine forestry. That does get us below the 0.35 milligrams per liter. But next slide, please. We're now working with the economists on a regional economic model, because converting the entire area to slash pine is not likely to be very positive for the rural economy and rural livelihoods. So this is the next phase in our project. We're developing various scenarios with the stakeholders that include climate change, big land use changes, and we'll be looking at that over the next couple of years. So next slide. So what will success look like in our minds? Basically, we would like the agriculture and the forestry and the conservation and the government stakeholders to really understand what the changes are that we need to achieve both water security and environmental protections. These aren't going to be small peaks. They're going to need new incentives, some transformative watershed scale modification, widespread adoption of BMPs, and substantial changes in cropping systems. We hope that we'll have a robust agricultural economy, and most importantly, trusted social networks to sustain positive change beyond the project. So next slide. This, of course, wouldn't be possible without all the great students we have working on this project. And next slide. If you want more information, floridonwater.org has lots of other information about this project. Thank you.
Wendy, thank you. And thanks to all the speakers and everything. I know we've gone a little over time, but you've heard a wealth of information this afternoon. And I'm going to turn over now, and if you could bring up the slide, because we developed an input tool. And I'm going to use this these results as the catalyst for the discussion and question aspects today. And here are the top 4 responses that we got. And if you want to continue to put input into this, those are instructions that we'll be sending you and everything, but they're on part of the web page as well. And part of this is that the most challenging issue to reducing nitrogen loss, and my slide went away. There we go. Thanks, Sarah. Is that we have the right technology, but our engagement tool to change behavior are not on target. That was one piece. So we know what to do. We just can't figure out how to get it done. The other one is that people say we don't have the right technological tools. And you've heard a lot of different tools today. We have the right technologies, but our systems are broken. We actually have poorly designed programs or off-base market values. Or they're all equally challenging, that we have a combination of not knowing what to do and everything else. So we're going to use this as the platform to ask each of the speakers questions, in terms of talking about the technologies, talking about behaviors. How do we begin to put these all into practice? So we'll bring up all the different speakers as a screenshot, and we'll be able to start sharing that and everything. So, and I'll start off the question as we go and go back to Bruno on this, because you talked about the aspects of being able to utilize digital agriculture, and actually David talked about some of the new things with Smart Farm. So are we developing the technology, and it really is a matter of just getting that technology into the hands of producers, consultants, in order to make this effective?
Thank you, Jerry. Well, just my opinion on this is I think the technologies are suddenly coming together. One thing, including myself, I could never really possibly dream of be able to know how much variability is across every field. And so that shows how much progress we have made with very low level of uncertainties because of the level of calibration and stuff, validation that we have done. The farmers like to have turnkey solutions. And so one complexity is that everybody approaches the farmer with one piece of the puzzle, but masking that kind of marketing approach as the solution to the problem when unfortunately it isn't. And so I guess that kind of addresses a little bit the engagement and the fact that everybody wants a piece of the farmer. The farmer operates on a very thin margin economically. Some do well depending on how big the farm is. And so that level of engagement varies, as Linda showed, the early adopters versus others, the age. But at least what I feel optimistic about is the possibility of implementing this sort of technology at a much larger scale. The second point, I do think the system is broken in a way because we prioritize incentives for some valid reasons about having yield subsidized through the insurance program and the part price kind of guaranteed and that sort of approach. But at the same time, we're not rewarding farmers for ecosystem services. And I think one of the value of my analysis shows that the areas that they lose most of the inefficient use of their cost of the inputs happens from some specific locations that could go to biodiversity, could go to alternative land use. But guess what? The insurance does not pay based on acreage. They say, if I go to this, I will not receive the level of incentives, the level of payment. Now my field is smaller. And even I engaged in the conversation with, even at the national level with insurance, and insurance get paid by the acreage. And the APH, the actual production history, does not get updated after 1 year, only if you do irrigations or major investments. So I think we need to make sure the stakeholders, the policymakers understand that if we focus on parts of the fields that will minimize the risk of the investment of a farmer's like an insurance. If I like the car, if I'm a good driver, my insurance is normally less. And same thing that way, but rewarding the farmer for adopting the right piece of technology. And in the end, we never really talked about the nitrogen problem, about the livestock, where a major, losses also come from them. The two systems are disconnected, and any practices that deals with regenerative agriculture is trying to push them, basically bringing them together. Is that a good thing? My economist friends say, they're much more efficient if they're separated, and that's why they went that way. And so there is complexity there about bringing these benefits, because if you hear the regenerative ag groups, the solution is there. Obviously, the soil is the answer, which I would fully agree with. The fact that soil being always covered, reduce erosion and bringing all those. But then the adoption and convincing the farmer, as Linda showed at the beginning, of saying, well, why do I have to do this extra work? So it's complex. I think the technologies there, policy are missing.
Sarah, are we going to bring up all the speakers to have them all on the screen? There we
Yes,
go.
let's go into that section right now.
All right. I see Raj's hand up. I see Tom's hand up. Raj, you have a question? And you need to unmute yourself.
Right now. So I have a couple of questions. The first one is for Bruno. Bruno, I really want to commend you for the large scale work that you and your group has performed. I think it is very important for us to have this global scale flavor of how our farm practices are translating into the nitrogen budget. And I think your study shows that. And you went one step forward, which is unique about your study, in that you translated into dollars and cents. Now, your study is a clear example where you documented that based on the current practices that farmers are undertaking, not all of them, but a lot of them are bleeding money. That's loud and clear.
Correct.
So if we were to look into future, trying to address this challenge where there is not only we're trying to reduce the nitrogen footprint, when you couple that with what is at risk, yields could go down. So how then we address this challenge? Because it's a two-edged sword. Given the magnitude of your work, have you given thought on that?
Yes, I'll try to be brief. I really have to go back to Ken's talk last week. Nitrogen is critical and is needed. What my study showed is that the area, which is more than 50% of constantly most of the fields, plus even the area that fluctuates, the unstable area, have a tendency to be more on the high yielding side, unless you have either a strong drought or too much a deluge where you lose one of the others. But so that has shown that you could sustainably intensify in a way where the uptake is happening. The point that I'm trying to make here, and farmers will actually resonate with me, is that you just cannot put close to 200 pounds on an area that yields 120 bushels. And they realized that until now, they said, well, I didn't know where they were, how they think, most of the farmers are overestimated in many ways because they manage very large enterprise. And so they don't really know exactly where these areas are. And so having a tools that allows them to incentivize the adoption of conservation practices. And I'll tell you one more reason. Instead of charging them, what is probably going to happen is that if you move, hopefully with the new administration, is that if you move from putting input, not putting input with the biodiversity, there is a possibility of sequestering more carbon, and they could get verified benefits in terms of carbon sequestration. They could potentially lead towards a market with all the complexity of verifying it. But we very well know that if you have a biodiversity strip, you returning those 5 tons, even if you either burn or sequester, put it down, they will go with no input. And so then the positive emission of agriculture obviously is highly related to the input. Once we at least eliminate the areas that they are more vulnerable, then we could solve it, because the high and stable areas have close to 80%, 85% efficiency of nitrogen. It's a leaky system, so you will always have some, losses, but at least you would not just reduce. Now, there is a land use change. The thing is, even if it's 20%, 25% of these low and stable areas, they're actually half in terms of acre, because the yield is about 100 bushels and it's not 200 bushel. So the footprint of producing that, for example, in Argentina, is significantly lower. So we're working on trying to package this in a climate benefit altogether. But until we provide incentives for farmers to have this biodiversity that will sequester carbon, will increase the biodiversity and all the jazz of the biodiversity big time stories, then we will get closer to a more sustainable, resilient, and circular system.
I'd like to ask Wendy and Carrie maybe to comment, because you've been working with stakeholders on this as well. So either one of you have some comments on this?
Well, I would agree that the payment for ecosystem services is going to be an essential component to keeping agriculture in our state, in particular in Florida. As I mentioned, I don't think this is small tweaks. I mean, certainly the technologies are there and not everybody's adopting them. So variable rate irrigation, variable rate fertilizer, drones, NDVI fertilization. But eventually, I do believe we have to pay more. We have to pay more for our food. I think everybody wants their clean water, their cheap food, and their low taxes, and all those things do not line up unless we want to say, okay, I'll keep our state pristine and we'll get all our agriculture from South America and not worry about the consequences. So I think just a reckoning across society of what it takes and how to be sustainable is important. So all of those factors are challenges that we need to address.
Carrie?
I think that's a great set of points, Wendy. A couple things that I would add. When we have some research that's, I say we pretty loosely, USDA and EPA have created a challenge, the Enhanced Efficiency Fertilizer Focus Challenge, and they're looking at both nitrogen and phosphorus. And one of the challenges that farmers, sometimes ag retailers have, is what data should they trust? Is it the company that has a particular product, or is it a land-grant university that might only compare one or two products? So this effort is going to compare multiple products. I don't think I can share the number yet, but I would between 10 and 20, both in the greenhouse and then in the field, to show the differences with these enhanced efficiency fertilizer products called the Next Gen Fertilizer Challenge. So that's one place that I feel like can help with adoption, is there's a trusted source of information that can look across all of the resources. The other thing that I would say is when ag retailers, when they have a suite of practices that they can offer a farmer, it sometimes is a little bit easier to make changes happen. So it's not asking piecemeal, can you change this one thing? It's, we've got this, we're going to do, soil sampling for you to get the zone or grid sampling. And then with that, we're going to add in VRT. And so it's, so the ag retailer has made the package easier for the farmer to adopt. It's not quite the easy button that someone had mentioned earlier, but it does kind of help stair step the way to more and different new nitrogen practices. One last thing is we're hoping to work with an entity to offer guarantees to farmers for yield changes, the yield change. Should you implement some of these, advanced practices, the farmers might be, as Bruno mentioned, concerned about a yield drag, especially if the prices are high. The risk is even worse. So we're hoping to test that out. I think it's been proven with some best management practices. We're going to also try that for nitrogen and phosphorus.
Tom, you have a question. And there you go.
Okay, sorry, trying to click the buttons to start my video. First of all, thanks for a great panel. And as a non-expert in agriculture and a public health person, I learned so much. And I think there's a lot to be optimistic about it. But the behavior issue and the lens of EHMI is to look at the big system, and obviously we heard last week a lot about emerging new evidence on health effects and the public health connection. So I would like to ask the group really if the public health aspects of the downstream effects and exposure can enter into the incentives and the behavioral equation, or what role does that health connection have in the mindset of decision making about nitrogen use, and or does it factor in at all?
I
We need
can
to tackle that.
go ahead, Linda. I'll come back.
There's some evidence that when issues are localized, so it's impacting drinking water in a local reservoir, that can certainly impact behavior. But the further away the impact, the less that changes behaviors. So that's a broad answer to that question.
I would add that the sensitivity to the health, I don't know if it is as drastic as the way we tackled the campaign against smoke, but there is certainly not a well-informed public about this level of impact on the health of people, which are extremely serious. And in addition, it's not just about the water, but I think that has created more of a divide because the nitrogen creates a big impact to the climate. And so by solving some of basically this critical element, you could link the two, the way the earth should respond and through the people that lives on it, through the decisions. And so I think it's a combination that needs to link sensitivity in relation to the environment. And I don't think farmers I often hear, this is my land, I do what I want, rather than thinking this is your grandchildren's neighbor's land because of the consequences further down. But the impact on health are not, I think, heavily described in the common literature, in the media and so on.
I wanted to add that source water protection was built into several programs in the last Farm Bill. And I think people thought that would have this effect. I haven't seen a lot yet. I don't know if others have of active roles by the drinking water systems of getting involved in reduction of nutrients or other chemicals. That was the thinking.
Alejandro?
And I would just point.
Oh, go ahead, Carrie.
I was just going to point back to in 2014, when Lake Erie had its drinking water problems, there was a lot of action that happened immediately after that. And the motivation to bring in multiple parties, that was huge. So I don't want a crisis to happen in order to initiate change, but I feel like in that case, it made people move more quickly with the Lake Erie and the water quality issue. Those harmful algal blooms had been connected to health issues before, but it was, I would say there was probably 10 years running up to 2014 before that happened. And so it did give time for people to kind of do some research and think about how they could act together. So I think it's going to take more than just education.
And I would say, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Wendy.
I was going to say that, the contamination of domestic drinking water wells is sort of an unseen, quiet problem. It's a rural, quiet problem that, whereas in Florida, the blue-green algae issue that we had in 2018 with Lake Okeechobee and the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie estuary, that was a very visible, it caused respiratory problems, and combined with red tide caused respiratory problems. So that's a much more visible thing to many, many more people versus the domestic water supply well, which is a very local, quiet, hidden problem, I think.
Alejandro, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Jer. So I just want to point out the political problem that linking health issues to agricultural production will create, since agriculture is a non-point source polluter. So in order to link those two, you would have to first link the problem to the point source polluters. And that will be faced with tremendous political lobby.
Okay.
You're talking about if the Clean Water Act is used, but that's not the only potential policy tool.
Lisa, you have a comment or a question?
is going to respond to the question about source water protection, or a comment that Jane made, and that I don't know if it's driven by the Farm Bill, but at least here in Iowa, the cities of Dubuque and Cedar Rapids and Ames are investing upstream to help farmers implement practices such as saturated buffers and bioreactors and cover crops and prairie strips, with the goal of, trying to address their own nutrient issues with regards to water quality. And so I'm really excited about that opportunity to link municipalities with upstream, and that recognition that we're all in this together, right? We all need clean water, and farmers need help in implementing these practices. So that's one thing. But the second thing I would say is that, and I'm not the first one to say this, but we need a second green revolution. And whereas the first green revolution was really motivated in addressing hunger, now we need a second one to address all of the environmental impacts of agriculture, and recognizing that people we need a clean environment as well as food. We need both in order to sustain ourselves and our livelihoods in our communities. So that systems level change that Tom had suggested.
I guess that begs the question, and I'll put it to all the panelists, including Linda, this afternoon. So what do we need to re-engineer in agriculture to affect this dynamic between the environment and ecology and health all simultaneously? Everything is on the table. We've heard a lot of different technologies. We've heard about the use of tools. We've seen so where do we start in all of this?
Can I just have a quick stab at it? I think we have to make the system more sensitive of a circularity approach. So basically the resources that they're generated have to be completely accounted, and the disconnect that we still have between the crop and the livestock. I mean, the livestock still produces a very large amount of waste, and even if it's with all the efforts of trying to get it back to some of the fields, they don't go very far into the areas, and there is a cost of. So I think circularity by increasing efficiency through some of the digital tools that I've shown, the ecosystem playing a role in terms of removing this unproductive land, but also things on the farm where more biogas needs to be produced, more energy generation. One of the scenarios that I've worked on is the fact of using wind turbines. The Chicago land area is actually giving away a lot of good land rather than putting these turbines, on unproductive land to generate energy that could be used on the farm, as well as the biogas. So circularity for me, it's not replacing sustainability or anything, but it's a concept that leads towards what we're really trying to be. It's in a normal life, we try not to waste. And so that needs to become more of a stronger thought at the starting at the farm level and track it down to the supply chain, because now the terminology is no longer agriculture, but they use agriculture and food systems. And so we need to start at being circular at the farm level and deliver improved quality of food all the way, rich food, and all the components of quality and impact on the health all together. So it's really part of a bigger system. And I think circularity is a concept that we kind of undermined so far.
I think we're partly having the wrong conversation, right? So, and I'm part of the problem, right? So today we talked about a lot of practices that are trying to make an unsustainable system marginally more sustainable, versus throwing out the unsustainable system and replacing it with something more sustainable, right? We subsidize, we incentivize, we support farmers to grow, in my part of the world, corn and soybeans. Is that really the best thing we can do with our land? I would argue no, but that's a really radical major change. And that's what I think we need.
Thank you, Linda. That's a great statement. Changing the cropping system does seem fundamental, and many researchers have shown how corn is fundamentally not sustainable. So that's great. The word that came to my mind was accountability, to use something that's a lot used in the national conversation about other things, but that people need to be accountable, or the farming system, the agricultural system needs to be accountable for the losses, for the externalities. That also goes along with understanding the benefits of each of these practices, and that's a very active area of research. How much reduction can you get from various practices? And we don't have clearly agreed on numbers for that. But if people were accountable for what's lost from either a farm or from a drainage area or a watershed, that would certainly change the incentives.
So,
I guess it would offer...
Jerry, do I?
Oh, go ahead, Carrie.
I feel like I'm always just jumping in.
I didn't see your hand.
A couple of things. I think we don't agree as a society on the ecosystem services or what the value of those externalities is either. So it's hard to say to a farmer or landowner, someone that's producing food, change it because we value it in this way or that way. So I think if we could agree on those, the value of the ecosystem services, on the value of those externalities, I think that would go a long way. And we could think about faster feedback loops to the farmer and the landowner. Oftentimes there is no way to understand the full extent of any externality until the next year, or maybe never, depending on how the nitrogen is measured or how the erosion is measured. So I think some of the technologies that we're talked about today are perfect to help make that those feedback loops faster, and then change can happen more quickly. But they're also going to need some sort of advisor to help figure out what to do with all that information.
Okay. Alejandro, I'm going to put you on the spot because when we talk about third crops for the Midwest, producers will say, well, there's no market, there's no value, so if I produce wheat or oats, who's going to buy them? And they all say, well, these are good things to put in the rotation, but how do we incentivize markets for this?
So that's a great point, Jerry. And I met with executives from Unilever, Switzerland, New York, and they actually are subsidizing, or let's say crop cost sharing with farmers in Iowa that introduce oats into their 3-year rotation with corn and soybeans, and not only oats but cover crops in the system. And they pay some money to these farmers, but the problem that these executives have, and that's why they called me was about how to report back to their stakeholders the impact that money was creating locally. So they wanted to prove that not only the oats sourced by Unilever were of good quality and produced environmentally friendly way, but that they could put a dollar value to that benefit, social benefit. And so I think the problem that Carrie was talking about is critical. Metrics. We are lacking metrics to tell the story. I mean, I would say generally recognized or generally agreed metrics that can be used across practices to measure impact. Currently, I didn't have a good answer for those executives, unfortunately.
So let's just talk about the metrics a little bit. So what would be the top 5 metrics that we would use to show improvement in efficiency, improvement in water quality? I mean, if we had to put those out, if you were asked to put those out by 4:30 this afternoon, what would we put down? And Carrie, you're grinning, so I'll start with you.
Well, so I don't know if all the technology exists to create it, right? And I think that's part of the part of it. But I was intrigued by the infield and monitoring those microneedles. If those can give feedback, you know, immediately to farmers to say this is what's happening with your nitrogen, I think that would be great. We have soil moisture probes in some places that so at different levels, you know, they're 36 inches long or something, and so at different levels they can measure what nutrients are there and how much moisture is there, and so that could also be a metric. But again, the feedback loop would have to be pretty quick. I think there needs to be some agreement on what we care about when it comes to soil carbon and how to measure that. I don't know that I have an answer at all for that. I just think we need to agree on what those metrics are and then share that back with the farmer. But I also think, you know, we have a lot of models. And so if a farmer is implementing cover crops, for example, could there be some sort of feedback loop to say, it just rained 2.5 inches because you have cover crops in place, or you know, wheat, for example, you prevented X amount of erosion from happening. It's not necessarily connected to nitrogen, but some of those feedback loops to say, you know what, this isn't paying right now, but you'll see some long-term impacts. What it is helping with right now is some erosion. So connecting some of those things that pay off, maybe have a longer payoff period to some immediate impacts, I think would be really helpful.
Dr. Shephers, you know, you've spent a long time and a whole career working on nitrogen and improvement, so I'm sure you've got a few thoughts for us on this.
Well, Jerry, it seems to me that we come back to this business of, if you can take water stress out of the management issue or greatly reduce it, it really changes the way people think, or the farmers think, and the attitude that they have toward managing other things. And part of what I also see is that you talked about specialty crops. The seed corn companies produce a lot of seed in Nebraska for a good reason, because of irrigation. It's stability, but what they also do is they encourage the farmers, when they go in and knock out the male rows, to plant cover crops.
Right.
And get those cover crops started, and then they bring cattle in to graze those things. And so even though you may say the seed corn production is not good, or they apply extra nitrogen, in essence, there's an opportunity there to recover some of that. But I'm not sure that the seed corn companies emphasize this enough to their growers. They throw it out there as an option, but if it doesn't happen, don't worry about it. I think there's some opportunity there to set an example for the seed companies.
Okay. David, you have your hand up.
Yes, just in terms of the discussion of, you know, how challenging it is to set metrics, especially for ecosystem services. You know, that's why ARPA-E decided to focus on the carbon intensity metric. You know, it's very well defined, it can be quantifiable, and it just so happens that nitrogen happens to make up a large component of that for, you know, the feedstock production. And while, you know, carbon intensity at the moment is somewhat limited in being utilized as, you know, a metric driving behavior change, you know, more and more regions are starting to talk about low carbon fuel standards. And when you think about approximately 1/3 of the corn crop going to biofuels at the moment, if you're able to quantify the carbon intensity of that corn going into biofuels, and you have market incentives established in some markets to incentivize reducing that carbon intensity, you know, we like to think that, you know, that could be one, you know, relatively easy. I mean, easy is obviously in quotation marks, but, you know, we've seen evidence just on utilizing machine data off of, you know, farm equipment to, you know, quantify the nitrogen application and then plug into, you know, the GREET model to calculate the carbon intensity, being enough to show that certain growers and growing practices can reduce their carbon intensity 10, 20% over national averages. And, that's our pathway that, we as the Department of Energy happen to be focused on at the moment.
All right, great. Lisa, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I did. Thanks, Jerry. So I have a few thoughts about this based on 17 years of data and conversations. Well, first of all, I think we've come back to the theme of profitability. I mean, that's got to be a metric. And if farmers are not profitable at growing annual row crops, why is society subsidizing that, undercutting that cost, when it's having such a huge impact on so many other aspects of our lives? Secondly, with my work on prairie strips, the main reason farmers come and talk to me and my team about prairie strips is because they're worried about losing their soil. So soil loss through erosion is a significant concern. They want to keep their soil. It's so important to their own bottom line and the resilience of their farm, that farm legacy, to keep their soil. So soil erosion. And then they're also asking about other aspects of soil health. What that measure is, Carrie, you probably know better than I, but there's got to be other soil health measures in there as well. And then I think we can point to the willingness to pay survey data that I shared, which showed that society, at least Iowans, are willing to pay for nutrient retention, and then they're willing to pay for farmers, and then they're willing to pay for soil, and then they're willing to pay for other wildlife benefits. Taken together, we have what is that now? 7 metrics? We can do this, right? What we don't have represented in our data thus far is anything about GHGs or climate resilience. And so, one great thing that could come from this panel, I think, is a nationwide willingness to pay study, looking at all of these environmental benefits that farms could provide to society and asking people, what are we willing to pay? How can we support our farmers to provide us with a clean environment in addition to food and fuel?
Jane, did you have a comment on metrics?
Yeah, no, it was back a little bit, but thank you, Lisa. That was very inspiring. This was more in response to Jim Shepard's, and he got me thinking about once water, the threat of water stress is taken away, what people are willing to do. The practice that we're probably most actively researching is very new here, the idea of water recycling. Somewhat circular, as Bruno said, at least it gets the idea that the water and nutrients would be circular. One of the difficulties is that there isn't much data showing the benefits of the irrigation, but this fact intrigued me that even in our very humid areas where drainage is a bigger issue than lack of water, there is still a lack of water. And so that's why there's so much nitrogen left at the end of the year in many years. So your comment that farmers are willing to try new things if the water stress is taken away has sort of intrigued me, as there might be more openness to other things if in a drainage water recycling kind of scenario where there is irrigation, even though it's not critical, it could open up to other practices.
Great. Peter and then Eric. Peter, you have a question?
Yes, and thank you very much for these great presentations both this week and last week. I come at this from the perspective partly as a farmer, but more as an advocate. And we've talked a lot about these great practices and how different policies could accelerate their adoption. And policies are a function of politics. So my question is really, how do we get there? I mean, we don't have, I would say, I'm going to oversimplify, let's say the environmentally unfriendly policies that we have now by accident. Those are the policies that have developed over years because of the way politics works and the way lobbying works, et cetera. And so it seems we basically know what we want to do. There's a lot of details in terms of practices, where and monitoring and all, but overall research on sustainable practices is a fraction of what it could be. And so it's not really our knowledge of what to do. And we also have some sense, those were great slides that you put together on who do farmers listen to? Unfortunately, mostly the private sectors who are trying to sell them products. chemicals and seeds or whatever. How do we change the politics so that then we can change the policies? I think, again, we know that what we need to do, we know the policies that would make a big difference. How do we get the politics to get those policies changed? That seems to be the real struggle. The voices of the rural communities, and only a small portion of people in rural communities are actually producers. More of them are working in other activities and suffer the consequences of the CAFOs nearby or the water pollution or whatever, and we're not listening to them. How can we change the politics?
Anyone on the panel want to address that one?
That's a big question, sorry.
That's why we have a big panel, Peter.
And the answer is challenging, right? I mean, if we look at, so a lot of politics obviously are shaped by lobbyists. If we look at our big ag lobbyists, and I'll use climate change as an example, it has taken a lot of our big ag lobbyists a long time to admit that climate change is happening, despite decades of science saying that is the case, right? And so I think we need to be working on those big farm groups, right? And helping them to see the science that change needs to happen, because they have the ear of the politicians.
Gary.
Thank you. I'll figure out my hand raise soon enough. But one of the things that I think, so let's just go back to some of the science that Linda talked about, right? So education isn't enough. There also has to be that whole set of things in place for behavior change. It's true for all people, for politicians included as farmers. And so when you think about some of the roadblocks or opportunities, I think we need to go back to Linda's research. And one of the things that I think politicians also want is a guarantee that their constituencies are going to be as good or better off with a new sort of policy. And so some of this is like just making sure, when you think about commodity producers, are they going to still be able to produce something later? Are they going to be out of business because of a new policy? So I feel like, as Linda had just said, it's complicated, but there's still people, and I feel like that same model that Linda talked about earlier could be applied. I also think that we have made huge progress. I used to work at the Farm Bureau in Michigan, and the conversations have just, it was, yes, we can talk about it 10, 15 years ago, and just because of just some things that they've experienced, things that they've learned, new research that's come out, I feel like the conversation has turned, and it is, how can we help? So I think we're in a good place to make some policy shifts.
Great, thanks for those comments. Eric, let's have you answer your question.
Okay, I will. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to turn on my video. Oh, there I go.
Yep, there you are.
Everybody, I really enjoyed the conversation. One of the things I haven't heard much about is the consumer. And when we talk about the food system, of course, we have to talk about the consumer. There was mention about how the consumers want affordable food, and we have a pretty good system to create fairly affordable food. But a lot of consumers also want to be responsible consumers, and the ones I know, my friends and family, when they think about trying to make choices at the supermarket that's good for the environment, what do? They buy organic. And I don't think any of us in this group would say that's really the answer. Not that I have anything against organically grown food, but I don't think any of us are going to advocate that that's the way to get more sustainable agriculture, is to go completely to organic. If we look at other commodities such as fish, for example, my local grocer has little signs up saying whether or not the fish is sustainably harvested. Now, one could argue as to whether they really have good metrics for that. That's debatable. Cans of tuna fish have a little symbol on it that say it's dolphin friendly. And that's really where what consumers want. The USDA has come up with regulations as to what a farmer has to do to be able to put on that little symbol that says it's organically grown. What if we came up with a set of best management practices that are measurable, confirmable, that would be used for putting a little symbol on that product? It seems like General Mills is interested. It seems like Walmart is interested in those sorts of things. Field to Market and all those people that are, all the companies that are supporting that. What if we had metrics that the scientific community could stand behind and maybe convince, whether it's USDA or environmental organizations or an industry collective, to accept those and say, and a few examples might be what fraction of the farm for how long a time has bare soil. It might be some metric of nitrogen use efficiency where farmers pretty much know how much they're harvesting and how much nitrogen is in it and how much they put on. So it's not a difficult calculation. It might be with new technologies coming out to make easier measurements of soil carbon or something like that. They'd have to be fairly simple. They'd have to be verifiable. They couldn't be, that you can actually measure how much nitrate is leaching out of your farm. That's almost impossible to do. But if we came up with some metrics about using best management practices and had the food chain industries connected to the consumers, could that not provide the kinds of incentives without increasing costs of food too far, and with still providing incentives for farmers to participate, maybe in some cases getting a slight premium for the crop that they produce? Is that kind of more of a redesign of the food system that we might need to try to introduce to move to a more sustainable system?
Good comments. Yeah. Thumbs up across there, Eric. I mean, I think that we often in agriculture do have a disconnect with the consumer and looking at this system. And as Bruno points out, it is a circular system, and I don't know that we fully appreciate all the linkages that go on. But I think as we go forward, we're going to have to look at much more of the connectivity among the different pieces and how it all fits. Alejandro, did you have a comment back? Your hand is back up. I didn't know if that was from before or now. So
no, it's a comment about Eric's discussion. So thank you. I agree the systemic approach is better than the piecemeal approach. But in looking at the labeling itself, there are plenty of labels. And once you have more than a few labels out there, like organic, natural, green, naturally environmentally friendly, and so on, then it becomes really difficult for the consumer to identify exactly what the benefit of buying this product over this other product that have two different labels really is. So the market segmentation, when there's a multiplicity of labels, makes the market for each of those labels really thin. So unless there's a political will to eliminate all USDA sponsored labels and recreate the system, I don't think it will work. It's a great idea, but I don't think it will work. And even if the USDA proceeds that way, we still have all the private labels that cannot be disputed, and USDA cannot go against those labels. So market segmentations will always be an issue.
Maybe it's the big retailers like Walmart that have to somehow be in the driver's seat, like for this. So maybe it isn't a label on each individual product. I don't know. I've never quite understood why Walmart is interested in regenerative agriculture, what they're getting out of it if they're not putting a label on it. But there must be something there that we're not understanding.
Jane, you have a comment.
I'm just wondering if anybody has thought about such a system for ethanol, which is of course the largest use of our cropland. It's harder to imagine.
I'm going to make a comment that this time is flowing by very quickly, and I will express my appreciation to Linda and to the panelists and everything. I think that you've put a lot of information out on the tables, and we've had a lot of great discussion. I'll leave you with this thought process, and I told producers that our biggest challenge over the next few years is really going to be how we manage water. And, you know, the water is a conveyance mechanism for soil and for nutrients and everything else. But I think as we get producers to understand what the water dynamics of landscapes are and the water dynamics of different systems is going to be, I think you saw that common thread throughout all the presentations this afternoon. And I think that really becomes our challenge, because as we understand how to handle one of those pieces, then we can understand how we start looking at the utilization of that crop, because it'll go back to reinforce a comment that Jim made, is that when we take the water stress out of the system, and a lot of these water stresses are relatively minor, they don't show up as being drought stresses. You would never characterize them as drought level, but they do impact productivity. And as we impact productivity, we really have magnified the impact of nitrogen inefficiency, phosphorus inefficiency. And if we want to improve that, we've really got to think about how do we enhance the capacity of being able to ensure that plant doesn't have stress. And you know that there's more and more data that point to that piece of it. And I think that it really gets back to this aspect that Lisa brought up and Jane brought up and Wendy brought up in looking at the overall system and the landscape of saying, how do we really manage not a field at times, but the overall landscape, and looking at where that field is placed. And I do really think it's going to take a different thought process for all of us to begin to move from that 40-acre field to that 2,000-acre landscape that we often have a scale on. And I think we have the technology to do this. I think we have the tools. But I think what we really lack, and coming out of this, is maybe the imagination of how do we bring those together? How do we really begin to put this into a different framework that we haven't utilized before? So with that, we're actually out of time for this afternoon. I'm going to turn it back over to, I guess it goes back to this. Oh, back to Kathy. She's waving her hand and everything. She's going to give us a preview of coming attractions for the next. And I really do want to express my thanks to the panelists this afternoon. Excellent job. I think we've had a lot of things to think about. I know I've got a lot of notes on the side of all the things that I've got that I'm going to be getting back with each of you to ask you some very specific questions about how we put some of this into implementation. So with that, my appreciation and thanks on behalf of all of us. And Kathy, it's yours.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you all the panelists. This was incredibly rich conversation. I can't, as an economist, I can't stop from making a comment that this group, with talking about technologies and all the different challenges, have done just an amazing job of describing how hard it is to address externalities that are at the scale of half of the United States land base with just a voluntary approach. And so as we continue to struggle with that and think through that, keep in mind all the incredibly useful information that we've learned both in the technology, but what we know about behavior and incentives. Really, really incredible. So thank you. I just want to end, in addition to thanking all of our speakers today, and Jerry for doing an amazing job of keeping us on track and engaged, to draw your attention to what we have queued up for you next week. Today, we heard a lot about individual farmer motivations, incentives, and technologies that can, at the farm field scale, address nitrogen. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those local issues, but we're going to get broader and talk about off-farm, large-scale changes. So innovative technologies, as well as decision-making, building coalitions, irrigated lands, and regulatory programs. So the broader context. So with that, I'll leave you. Have a great evening, and feel free to visit our website and share our slides and copies of this today's presentation. Be well, everybody.